Victor Ashcroft slammed the contract onto the table hard enough to rattle every coffee cup in the room. "Sign it," he said, "or I'll make sure every bank in this county knows your ranch isn't worth the dirt it sits on." The room went dead silent. 12 ranchers, 12 families, 12 futures hanging on one moment. And not a single person moved because everyone in Red Hollow knew Victor Ashcroft didn't make threats. He made promises. What Victor didn't know, what nobody knew, was that a quiet woman standing in the back of that room had already dismantled every lie he'd spent 3 years building. She had the numbers, she had the proof, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. If you were sitting in that room, would you have signed before we find out what happened next? If stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things move you the way they move me, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Every week I bring you stories that will make you question everything you think you know about strength, silence, and survival. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is going to take a while, and it is worth every minute. The morning of the Red Hollow Frontier Stock Fair started the way most mornings did in that part of Wyoming. Slowly, reluctantly, like the land itself wasn't sure it wanted to wake up. The sky turned from black to gray to a washed-out kind of pale gold, and the dust along the main road started lifting before the first wagon wheel even rolled through it. Silas Mercer arrived at the fairgrounds before most people had finished their coffee. That was his habit, had been for years. He'd learned early that if you showed up first, you controlled where you stood, and if you controlled where you stood, you controlled how many people could corner you. He was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from decades of actual work rather than vanity. His face had been weathered into something that photographs would have called distinguished, and that he himself would have called tired. He had deep-set eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain. Not particularly attractive, not particularly alarming, just watchful. Always watchful. Silas Mercer watched everything and said as little as possible, and the entire county had spent years mistaking that silence for grief. They weren't entirely wrong. He had been engaged once, 13 years earlier, to a woman named Catherine Pruitt, who had grown up 3 counties over and come to Red Hollow full of ideas about what a rancher's life would look like from the inside. She lasted 14 months before she told Silas that she loved him, but couldn't spend the rest of her life talking to someone who seemed to be somewhere else, even when he was standing right in front of her. He never argued with her about it. That was probably the problem. He'd watched her wagon roll down the long drive toward the main road, and then he'd walked back into the barn and spent the next 4 hours repairing a fence line that hadn't needed repairing, and that was the last time anyone in Red Hollow saw Silas Mercer cry. People assumed it had broken him. The truth was more complicated and considerably less romantic. He hadn't broken. He'd simply decided that some doors were easier to leave closed. 13 years of closed doors had made him the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, and also the most exhausting one to pursue. The women who came to the stock fair every year understood this, and they came anyway, because Mercer Ranch was 1,100 acres of prime grazing land, a solid house, 2 working wells, and a man who, whatever his emotional limitations, did not gamble, did not drink to excess, and had never once raised his voice to another person in public. In a frontier settlement, that combination was practically irresistible. By 9 in the morning, Silas had already been approached by the Hendersons' eldest daughter with a basket of biscuits, by the widow Clara Fontaine with an invitation to Sunday dinner, and by a woman he didn't recognize who simply walked up, shook his hand firmly, introduced herself as Margaret somebody or other, and told him straight out that she was 34, healthy, good with animals, and looking for a practical arrangement. He'd thanked all 3 of them with the same careful politeness he used for everything. A slight nod, a few neutral words, a face that gave away nothing. And then he'd maneuvered himself toward the livestock pens where the conversations were about cattle prices instead of matrimony. That was where Eleanor Graves found him. She wasn't looking for him. That was the first thing that registered, somewhere in the back of his mind where he cataloged things without meaning to. She was walking with purpose along the east side of the fairgrounds, carrying a worn leather satchel over one shoulder and scanning the vendor tables with the focused attention of someone running through a mental checklist rather than enjoying an afternoon out. Her dress was clean but not new. Her boots had been resoled at least twice. She wore her dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who considered it a logistical problem rather than a feature. She was, by any conventional measure of the word, plain. Not homely, not forgettable, just unadorned in a way that most women in Red Hollow would have considered either poverty or stubbornness. She walked past Silas without looking at him. He noticed that more than he would have admitted. It was a man named Calhoun, one of his senior ranch hands, who created the collision, not literally, but the kind of social collision that happens when someone talks too loud in a crowd, and suddenly the wrong people are standing close enough to hear. Calhoun was jawing with a feed supplier 2 pens over, and his voice carried the way voices do when a man has spent 30 years outdoors and never learned to modulate for enclosed spaces. "Can't figure what the boss is waiting for," Calhoun was saying, not unkindly, but not quietly either. "Man's got everything a woman could want and nothing she could actually reach. You know what I mean? Like trying to shake hands with a fence post." The feed supplier laughed. Silas stiffened. Eleanor Graves, passing within 6 feet of the conversation, slowed her stride without stopping. She didn't look at Silas. She looked at Calhoun, and something crossed her face. Not amusement, not pity, something quieter and more specific than either of those. Recognition, maybe. Then she kept walking. Silas found himself watching her disappear into the crowd near the accounting tables. There was always a small section at the stock fair where work agents and hiring notices were posted, people looking for seasonal labor or skilled hands, and he had the strange, uncomfortable feeling that he had just missed something important. He couldn't have said what. He didn't have long to think about it. By 10 o'clock, he was standing in front of one of those hiring notice tables with a problem. The ranch's bookkeeper, a retired school teacher named Mr. Plunkett, who had managed Mercer's accounts for 8 years with cheerful incompetence and unwavering loyalty, had suffered a mild heart episode 3 weeks earlier. The doctor said he needed rest and specifically said no ledgers. Plunkett had tried to argue, and the doctor had simply taken the ledgers out of his hands and handed them to Plunkett's wife, and that had been the end of that. Silas had been managing the books himself since then. He was a good rancher. He was not a good bookkeeper. He knew this. The numbers he'd been staring at for 3 weeks knew it better than he did. He was standing at the hiring table reading a notice from someone claiming experience in ranch accounting and general financial management when a voice behind him said, "That notice is 2 weeks old. The man who wrote it took a position in Cheyenne on Tuesday." He turned. Eleanor Graves was standing behind him, close enough to read over his shoulder, apparently without any particular self-consciousness about it. "I know because I spoke with him," she said, already moving to look at the next notice down the board. "He was asking the same questions I was asking. We were competing for the same 3 possibilities." She pulled a folded paper from her satchel, glanced at it, put it back. "2 of those are gone. This is the 3rd. Silas looked at her for a moment. "Are you an accountant?" "I'm a very good accountant," she said, which was different from what he'd asked, and they both knew it. "I have 8 years managing books for 2 different merchant operations in Laramie. One of them was 3 times the size of your ranch." She paused. "I'm assuming you're Silas Mercer. You look like someone who owns something substantial and is pretending he isn't irritated right now." He stared at her. "You've been doing your own books," she said. Not a question. "My bookkeeper is ill." "I know, Mr. Plunkett. He mentioned your operation specifically when we were talking on Wednesday. He said—" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "He said the accounts needed a real professional before something got missed that couldn't be unmissed." Silas felt something cold move him that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What exactly did he tell you?" "Nothing specific. He wasn't that kind of man." She met his eyes directly, which more people should have done and mostly didn't. But a bookkeeper doesn't describe his employer's accounts as needing a professional unless he's been quietly worried about something he didn't feel qualified to address. The livestock pen behind them erupted briefly with the complaint of several unhappy cattle, and the moment stretched in the noise before settling back to something that felt unusually serious for 10 o'clock at a stock fair. "I'm not hiring a woman on reputation alone," Silas said. "Of course not," Eleanor said. 60 days. Evaluate my work at 30 and again at 60. If you're dissatisfied at 30, you pay me for 30 days and I leave. If you're satisfied at 60, you negotiate my rate for a permanent arrangement or we part ways professionally." She reached into her satchel and produced a folded document. "I had someone write up the terms this morning because I was planning to propose this arrangement to whoever was standing at this table." He took the document. Read it. Read it again. You drafted contract terms this morning for a job you didn't have yet. I drafted contract terms for a category of position, she said. I've been looking for this kind of work for 6 weeks. I stopped waiting for circumstances to cooperate. Silas Mercer had met a great number of people in his life. He had met ambitious people and dishonest people, and people who were both. He had met people who wanted things from him, and people who pretended not to want things from him while wanting them very much. He had spent 13 years developing an exceptionally calibrated sense for the difference between someone who was selling something and someone who was simply telling him the truth. He folded the document and put it in his coat pocket. Monday morning, he said, 7 o'clock. Ask for Calhoun at the gate and he'll bring you to the house. Eleanor Graves nodded once, businesslike, not triumphant, and turned to leave. Miss Graves? She stopped. Plunkett, Silas said carefully. When he said the accounts needed a professional, did he seem frightened? There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. Yes, she said. He did. She walked away into the fair crowd without looking back, and Silas stood at the hiring table with a piece of drafted contract in his pocket and the distinct sensation that he had just agreed to something considerably larger than a 60-day bookkeeping arrangement. He was right. He just didn't know yet exactly how large. The ranch hands noticed Eleanor's arrival on Monday with the special brand of skepticism that men reserve for situations they've already decided are foolish before any evidence presents itself. Calhoun, the same man who'd made the fence post comparison at the fair, was professionally polite and personally doubtful, a combination he wore the way some men wear old hats, comfortably, without thinking about it. He showed her to the small office that had been Plunkett's, which smelled of old paper and the particular mustiness of numbers that had been handled by anxious hands for too long. And he said, Mr. Mercer said you'd want the last 3 years of ledgers. They're on the shelf there. He also said to tell you breakfast is at 6 and supper is at 7, and you're welcome at both if you want. Thank you, Eleanor said. And he said, Calhoun paused, like a man deciding whether to deliver the second half of a message. He said, don't move anything without logging what you moved and why. That's a reasonable instruction for someone who doesn't know me yet. Calhoun looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something. You're not what I expected. Most people aren't what I expect either, she said pleasantly, and turned to the shelf of ledgers, and Calhoun took that as the polite dismissal it was and left. Eleanor set her satchel on the desk, removed her coat, and took the first ledger from the shelf. She had told Silas that Plunkett seemed frightened. She had not told him the specifics of why she believed that, because she hadn't wanted to alarm him before she'd seen the books herself. Plunkett hadn't named numbers. He'd named a feeling, a creeping sense, he'd said, that things had been moving around him for a long time in ways that were just outside his ability to see clearly. Eleanor had heard that description before. She'd heard it from the merchant in Laramie, who discovered 3 years into his partnership that his accountant had been skimming from every third invoice in a rotation designed specifically to stay beneath the threshold that triggers instinctive suspicion. Not dramatic theft, patient theft. Theft with a long view. She opened the ledger and started reading from the beginning, not from the present. By lunchtime, she had covered 14 months of records and identified 6 discrepancies that could be innocent: rounding, timing, simple arithmetic, and 2 that could not be either of those things. She ate lunch at the ranch house table with Silas and 3 of his senior hands, and she said nothing about what she'd found, because what she'd found in the first 6 hours was not evidence. It was a pattern, and a pattern isn't proof. A pattern is an invitation to look harder. She looked harder. The housekeeper, a woman named Ruth Bellamy, had the sharp eyes of someone who'd managed large households long enough to recognize trouble by its footprints. She brought Eleanor coffee on Tuesday afternoon without being asked, set it on the edge of the desk, and said, You've been here 2 days and you haven't asked a single question. Eleanor looked up. People who are looking for something, Ruth said, ask a lot of questions. People who are finding something go quiet. There was a long pause. How long have you been here? Eleanor asked. 11 years. Did you know the foreman before Silas hired him? Ruth's expression didn't change dramatically. It shifted, just slightly, just around the eyes. Garrett Holt came with a recommendation from the Crawford operation over in Casper. Did anyone verify that recommendation? Ruth picked up the empty coffee cup from that morning that Eleanor had forgotten to return to the kitchen and turned it over in her hands. Mr. Plunkett asked me that same question about 8 months ago, she said quietly. I told him then what I'll tell you now. I don't know. I was never asked. Eleanor nodded. She wrote nothing down in that moment, but she filed the information in the place where she kept things that mattered, a place that had been filling up with an uncomfortable speed since Monday morning. The coffee is good, Eleanor said. Thank you, Ruth. Ruth left without another word, which Eleanor understood to be its own kind of answer. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had stopped sleeping well. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the specific restlessness of someone who can see the outline of something enormous in the dark and knows that when the light comes up, it's going to be bigger than she hoped. She was right. The fraud wasn't crude. That was what made it so damaging, not just financially, but in the way it revealed how much a trusted man can steal when he understands that trust itself is the blind spot. Garrett Holt, the foreman who'd come with the Crawford recommendation that nobody had verified, had been operating a systematic diversion for at least 4 years, possibly longer. He had a relationship with 2 supply contractors. Every third or fourth order placed, a portion of the goods listed on the invoice would not arrive at the ranch. The payment would go through in full. The shortage would be absorbed into the general noise of a busy operation, a few bales of feed short, a few tools unaccounted for, and the ranch's real consumption would be managed downward in ways that looked like efficiency. It was elegant, in the way that cruel things sometimes are. The total, when Eleanor finally put it on paper in one place, made her sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a full minute. $53,000, over 4 years, give or take. Gone. Not all at once. Not in ways that rang alarms. Just steadily, quietly, through the gap between what the paper said and what the reality was, through the space between a man who trusted and a man who exploited that trust. Eleanor sat in the small office that smelled of old paper and thought about how to do this right. Because the how mattered enormously. She could go to Silas with the numbers tonight and watch the look on his face and let his anger do what anger does, which is move fast and burn hot, and sometimes destroy things that shouldn't be destroyed. Or she could be careful, gather the complete picture, make the case airtight, give him something he could act on with authority rather than fury. She chose careful. She took 2 more days. She documented everything twice. She cross-referenced invoice records with delivery logs, with payroll records. She wrote it up in plain language alongside the numbers, because she knew from experience that evidence that can't be understood by the person reading it is just paper. On Thursday evening of the second week, she knocked on the door of Silas Mercer's study, and when he called her in, she sat down across from him and put the report on the desk between them and said, I need you to read this before I tell you what it means, because I want you to see it the way I saw it, without anyone else's interpretation in the way. He looked at her for a moment. Is it bad? She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. It's recoverable, she said. But yes, it's bad. Silas Mercer picked up the report. Eleanor watched his face as he read, the way she always watched faces when the truth was being absorbed, looking for the precise moment when understanding becomes something heavier and more personal. His jaw tightened at the 3rd page. His hand went still at the 5th. By the 7th page, which had the total, he set the papers down and was quiet for a long time. Garrett Holt, he finally said, and 2 suppliers. I have their names in the back. Another silence. The lamp on the desk made the room feel smaller than it was, the light reaching the walls and stopping. He's been here 6 years, Silas said. I know. I trusted him. I know. Silas put his hands flat on the desk, a gesture that looked like a man trying to hold something in place. What do you need from me to make this stick? Eleanor felt something release in her chest. The specific tension of someone who has been waiting to find out whether the person across from them is going to be reasonable or not. Some men, confronted with this kind of evidence about someone they'd trusted, turned that emotion sideways and aimed it at the messenger. She had experienced that before. It was the thing she had dreaded most about this moment. Silas Mercer was not that kind of man. I need access to 2 more sets of records, she said, and I need you to act normally for the next 5 days. Don't change anything. Don't say anything to Holt or to either supplier. Let me finish. He looked at her steadily. 5 days. 5 days. And then? And then you call them into this room one at a time, and you don't need me present at all because the paperwork will do everything that needs to be done. He nodded slowly. The lamp flickered once and steadied. Miss Graves, he said, and there was something different in his voice. Not warmer exactly, but more direct, like a door opened somewhere. When Plunkett told you the accounts needed a professional, is this what he was afraid of? Eleanor thought about the old bookkeeper's face on the Wednesday afternoon they'd talked, the way he'd chosen his words with the excessive care of a man who didn't want to say anything he couldn't take back. I think, she said carefully, that he saw enough to be scared and not enough to be sure, and he didn't know what to do with that. Silas was quiet for a moment. He should have come to me. People who've worked for someone a long time, Eleanor said, sometimes find it harder to bring bad news to that person, not easier. It accumulates too much weight. He considered that. Then he said, You've only been here 2 weeks. Which is why it was easier for me, she said simply. I don't have anything to lose yet. The words landed in the room and stayed there, and Eleanor immediately wondered if she'd said them wrong. Too bluntly, too unguarded, the kind of thing you say when you're tired and focused and forget to manage how you're coming across. But Silas Mercer just looked at her with those watchful creekwater eyes and said, No, I suppose you don't. He picked up the report again. 5 days, he said. 5 days, she confirmed. She stood to leave, and when she reached the door, he said her name. Not Miss Graves, just Eleanor, which was the first time, and she turned. The work you've done so far, he said, it's... He stopped, started again. Plunkett was a good man. He just wasn't... He did what he could with what he had, Eleanor said. That's all any of us do. She left him with the lamp and the report and the weight of 4 years of stolen trust, and she walked down the dark hall of Mercer Ranch's main house to the small room they'd given her, and she sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and let herself be tired for exactly 10 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Because 5 days was not very long, and there was still more to find. And somewhere beneath the stolen invoices and the manipulated delivery logs, and the $53,000 of patient practice theft, Eleanor Graves had a feeling, the same feeling she always got when one problem was sitting on top of a bigger one, that Garrett Holt's fraud was not the largest thing wrong with Mercer Ranch. It was just the first thing she was allowed to see. The 5 days felt longer than they should have. Eleanor had worked through difficult situations before. The Laramie merchant who discovered his partner had been lying to him for 2 years. The widow in Casper who needed to understand why her late husband's business had less money in it than the will suggested. But those situations had the particular clarity of problems that were already finished. Someone had already done something wrong. The wrongdoing was complete. Her job was to document the edges of a wound that had already stopped bleeding. This was different. This was still happening. Every morning that Garrett Holt rode out to supervise the ranch's daily operations, every invoice he signed, every conversation he had with the 2 suppliers whose names Eleanor had written at the back of her report, all of it was still active, still moving, still accumulating in the careful way that patient theft accumulates. She had to watch that and say nothing and act as though she had noticed nothing, and the effort of that performance was its own kind of exhausting. She was good at it. She'd had practice at it in ways she didn't particularly enjoy remembering. Holt himself was not what she'd imagined from the paperwork. She had pictured someone sly, a man with shifting eyes and a too-easy smile, the kind of person who broadcasts a certain kind of low-level wrongness, if you know how to read it. Instead, he was a large, quiet man in his late 40s with a direct manner and calloused hands, and a way of talking to the ranch hands that suggested genuine authority built over time. The men respected him. That was clear in every interaction she observed from a careful distance. Which made it worse, in a way she was still working out how to explain. The most damaging fraud she'd ever documented wasn't committed by the people who looked like they might do it. It was always committed by someone that everyone had already decided was trustworthy, because the decision to trust is the thing that opens the door. And once a door is open, what comes through it isn't always what you invited. On the 3rd day, Holt knocked on the doorframe of the small office and asked if she needed anything. Just that. Polite, brief, professionally curious. She said she was fine, thank you, still working through the historical records. He nodded and left. She watched him walk down the hall toward the back of the house and thought about how a man who had stolen $53,000 from the person who employed him could look that settled in his own skin, and she filed the observation in the place where she kept things she didn't have an answer for yet. Silas, for his part, did exactly what she'd asked. He maintained his routine without apparent difficulty, which told Eleanor something about him that she was careful not to read too deeply into. Either he was very good at concealing emotion when necessary, or the anger had converted itself quickly into something colder and more controlled. Both were possible. Both were useful in different ways. On the fourth evening, she was still at her desk past 9 o'clock when she heard his boots in the hallway, and then a knock that was more courtesy than request, since the door was already open. "You should eat," he said from the doorway. "Ruth left something on the kitchen table. I'll get to it." He leaned one shoulder against the frame with the ease of a man who has lived in a house long enough to treat its architecture like furniture. "Have you found more?" She looked up from the ledger. "A little. Nothing that changes the total significantly. I'm mostly verifying now." She paused. "There's something else I've been thinking about." "Tell me." "When this is done, when Holt is gone and the suppliers are dropped, there's going to be a period where the ranch's accounts look worse before they look better. The fraud concealed losses, but it also concealed the real operating picture. And once you remove the manipulation, the actual numbers are going to be visible for the first time in years." She folded her hands on the desk. "Some of what's underneath is manageable. Some of it is going to require decisions." Silas was quiet for a moment. "How bad is manageable?" "Honest answer? The ranch isn't in danger if you make adjustments now. It's been bleeding slowly for 4 years, but the underlying operation is sound. You have good land and you've been running it well." She paused again. "But you have some contracts that were renegotiated downward at some point, and I want to understand who did that renegotiation before I assume it was a market decision." The shift in his expression was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite surprise. "Holt handled supplier contracts," he said. "I know." He stood away from the doorframe. "Eat something," he said. I'll be up early." She ate. She went to bed. She lay in the dark of the small room with her mind moving through numbers and patterns, and the specific anxiety of someone who can see that the picture is bigger than the frame and doesn't yet know how much bigger. And she slept eventually, badly, the way she had been sleeping since she arrived. On the 5th day, she finished. The meeting happened in the early afternoon, when the ranch was quiet, in the particular post-lunch lull that settles over working operations in the middle of the day. Eleanor sat in the chair near the window of Silas's study with her completed documentation in a neat stack on the side table and listened to the muffled sounds of the confrontation happening in the next room. She hadn't been asked to be present. She hadn't wanted to be. There was a kind of violence in those moments. Not physical, but the particular violence of a trust being severed. And she had learned that her presence in them was rarely useful and often counterproductive. Her job was to make the evidence so clear that it didn't need her to explain it. She heard Holt's voice rise once. She heard Silas's not at all. 20 minutes. Maybe slightly less. Then the sound of a door and boots crossing the main hall and the front entrance closing with more force than was strictly necessary. Silas came into the study and sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely tired. Not the habitual guardedness she'd learned to read as his default expression. Actual fatigue. The kind that comes from doing something difficult that had to be done and would not stop being difficult just because it was done. "He denied it," Silas said. "They usually do. He said the numbers were wrong, that Plunkett had made errors that I was misattributing to him." He was quiet for a moment. He was very confident about it. "People who have been doing something for 4 years without being caught develop a certain confidence," Eleanor said. "It's almost indistinguishable from actual innocence if you don't have the documentation to hold up next to it." "But we do. We do." Another silence. Outside, she could hear someone working in the yard, the rhythmic sound of a shovel or a post hole digger, ordinary work continuing in the ordinary way that work does, even when something important has just ended. "He said," Silas started and then stopped. Started again. "He said you'd manufactured evidence, that you had a reason to make him look bad because you wanted his position." Eleanor considered this for a moment without any particular emotional response. She'd expected something like it. "What did you say?" I said the documentation covered 4 years of records before you arrived at this ranch. And unless you have a means of traveling backward through time, that argument has a problem. Something relaxed in her face that she hadn't realized was tense. The suppliers, she said. I'll contact them this week. In writing, with copies kept. He looked at her. Is there anything else you need from me before I do that? I'd recommend a witness to those conversations. Someone from outside the ranch operation. A county official if you have a relationship with one, or a lawyer. I know the county land recorder. He's honest. That works. Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the gesture of a man taking inventory, and then looked at her again. The other contracts, the ones that were renegotiated. I want to look at them tomorrow. Fresh eyes. Fine. He was quiet for a moment. Miss Graves, what you've done here in 2 weeks, it's what you hired me for. It is, he said. But there's a difference between what you hired someone to do and what they actually do. He stopped there, apparently having run into the edge of something he didn't have the language for, which was a thing Eleanor had noticed about him. He was precise until he wasn't, and when he ran out of precision, he just stopped talking rather than filling the space with imprecision. She respected that, even when it made him difficult to read. Get some rest, she said. The books will still be here in the morning. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the suggestion of one, the structural possibility of one, but it was more than she'd seen from him before. She took it as progress. The next 3 weeks had their own rhythm, less dramatic than the discovery, but more demanding in a sustained way. Eleanor worked through the renegotiated contracts and found what she'd expected to find. 2 agreements that had been quietly restructured to benefit Holt's supplier connections, costing the ranch a modest but real percentage of its margins over several years. She documented those and added them to the record. She rebuilt the payroll structure, which had accumulated unnecessary redundancies. She contacted 2 of the suppliers Holt had worked with, and using the most neutral language available to her, requested invoice reconciliations that would have been impossible to refuse without revealing guilt. Both suppliers sent money within 10 days, not the full amount, but enough to confirm the pattern and enough to begin the process of recovery. The ranch hand's skepticism of Eleanor didn't disappear quickly or completely, but it changed texture. Calhoun stopped making the fence post comparisons. A younger hand named Tate, who had initially made a point of not acknowledging her presence at the breakfast table, started asking her questions about the ledgers, practical questions, genuine curiosity, the kind of wondering that comes from watching someone work and realizing you don't understand what they're doing, but it seems important. She answered his questions directly and without condescension, which apparently surprised him enough to mention it to Calhoun, because Calhoun came to her office the following morning and said, with the particular gruffness of a man performing a task outside his comfort zone, Tate says you explained invoice reconciliation to him without making him feel stupid. He asked good questions, Eleanor said. He's 19. Good questions don't have an age requirement. Calhoun stood there for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. I said some things at the fair, he said, about Mr. Mercer. You probably heard them. I heard them. He nodded slowly, working through something. I didn't mean disrespect to him. It's just, he's been alone a long time and everybody can see it, and there's something frustrating about watching a man you respect not... He stopped. Not let anyone close enough to help him, Eleanor offered. Calhoun pointed at her. Exactly that. He put his hat back on. Anyway, you're doing good work here. Thought you should hear it said plain. He left before she could respond, which was almost certainly intentional. Ruth Bellamy's shift in attitude was less verbal but more total. She began leaving fresh coffee outside the office door every morning at 7:30 precisely, without being asked and without comment, which in Ruth's language was approximately equivalent to a formal declaration of alliance. The neighboring women of Red Hollow were a more complicated matter. Eleanor had not expected social acceptance, hadn't looked for it, hadn't needed it, but she had underestimated the specific creativity with which a small frontier community processes an anomaly. She was 31, unmarried, living on a property owned by an eligible man, hired for a role that involved knowing the intimate details of his finances. The story that assembled itself around those facts in the conversations of Red Hollow was not particularly kind and bore only an accidental relationship to reality. She heard about it first from Ruth, who told her in the direct way of someone who believes that knowing about a problem is better than being surprised by it. "People are talking," Ruth said, setting down the coffee one morning and staying in the doorway instead of leaving. "Not mean-spirited, mostly, just talking." "I know," Eleanor said. "Clara Fontaine told the Henderson women that you must have said something very particular to Mr. Mercer at the fair to get yourself hired the same day you met him." Eleanor looked up. "What do you think I said?" Ruth tilted her head. "I think you told him the truth about something. That's usually what surprises men enough to act fast." "He asked me if Plunkett seemed frightened," Eleanor said. "I told him yes." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "And what did he do?" "He hired me." "Well," Ruth said, and picked up the empty cup from yesterday and went back to the kitchen, and that was apparently the entirety of her analysis. The social noise didn't stop, but Eleanor had made a practice years ago of not spending energy on audiences she hadn't invited. She worked. The ranch's accounts began to look different, not recovered, that would take longer and require decisions that weren't hers to make, but visible in a way they hadn't been. Honest. She could look at the numbers now and see the ranch rather than the deception layered over it. It was in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in the 5th week, while Eleanor was cross-referencing cattle sale records with a regional price index she'd requested from the county office, that she found the discrepancy that changed everything. It started small. A land valuation notation in a correspondence file. She shouldn't have been in at all. She'd been looking for an invoice reference and opened the wrong drawer, and the paper was sitting on top of everything else as though it had been placed there recently rather than filed. The letter was from a land acquisition company in Denver. The letterhead meant nothing to her. The date was 6 weeks ago, 3 weeks before she'd arrived at the ranch. The subject was an inquiry about the purchase of Mercer Ranch's eastern pasture land at a valuation that was, by Eleanor's immediate and instinctive calculation, approximately 40% below current market value. She set the invoice she'd been looking for face down on the desk. She read the letter twice more. The acquisition company was named Ashcroft Land and Development. The signatory was someone named Victor Ashcroft, regional director. She'd never heard that name. It meant nothing to her in the context of Red Hollow or Mercer Ranch or anything she'd been investigating for the past 5 weeks. She put the letter back exactly where she'd found it. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the eastern pasture. Visible from the office window, a long stretch of good flat grazing land that caught the afternoon light in a particular way. And she thought about why a Denver land acquisition company would be offering to buy 40 acres of Wyoming grazing land at 60 cents on the dollar 6 weeks before the previous ranch foreman had been exposed for systematic fraud. She thought about the Crawford operation in Casper, which had provided the recommendation that nobody ever verified. She thought about the 2 suppliers who had sent money without fighting it, which people who are actually innocent tend not to do. She thought about a pattern that was bigger than one ranch. She needed more information before she said anything to anyone. That was the discipline. Information before conclusions, conclusions before action, action only when the picture was complete. She had violated that discipline exactly once in her career in Laramie when she'd been angry enough about what she was seeing to move too fast, and the resulting mess had cost her a month of work and a professional reference she could never get back. She would not make that mistake here. She started with what was available to her in the ranch records, looking for any other correspondence with Ashcroft Land and Development, any other land inquiries, any indication that this single letter was part of a longer conversation. She found nothing else in the files, which meant either the conversation had been conducted elsewhere or the file had been deliberately kept minimal. That evening she asked Silas, with the careful neutrality she'd learned to use when she didn't want a question to arrive loaded, whether he'd received any land purchase inquiries recently. He looked at her over the supper table. The ranch hands were there, Calhoun, Tate, 2 others. And she'd timed the question deliberately because a question asked in company is answered differently than one asked in private, and she wanted the unguarded version. "Not recently," he said. "There was something last year from a Denver firm. I didn't respond." "Which firm?" He thought about it. "Ashcroft, I think. Something development." "And you didn't respond?" "The price they suggested wasn't serious." He reached for his coffee. "Why?" "I came across a document today that may be related to something I'm tracking," she said. "I'll have more information in a few days." Calhoun looked up from his plate. Tate looked at Calhoun, Neither of them said anything. Silas held her gaze for a moment with that watchful steadiness of his. "Take the time you need," he said. She did. She spent 2 days moving through every piece of correspondence she could access, building a picture from the edges in the way you approach a thing when you can't look directly at it yet. She found 3 more references to land inquiries at neighboring operations, all mentioned in passing in county notices and regional agricultural bulletins that the ranch subscribed to. The Kellerman operation, the Fuller family's eastern section, Old Man Dawson's place on the river. All of them had received inquiry letters from companies she'd never heard of before. On the 3rd day, she rode into town. Eleanor was not a confident rider. She had learned out of necessity rather than affinity, and horses had a way of sensing her uncertainty and making editorial comments about it that she found irritating. The horse Calhoun lent her was old and professionally uninterested in her emotional state, which made him exactly right for the ride into Red Hollow's small commercial district. The county land office had a clerk named Emmett Briggs, who was 40 years old and had worked the same desk for 15 years, and had, in that time, developed the particular omniscience of someone that everyone regards as furniture and therefore speaks freely around. Eleanor had met men like Emmett Briggs before, and she knew exactly how to talk to them, straightforwardly, with genuine respect for the information they carried. Because people who are treated as furniture by most of their visitors are uncommonly appreciative of being treated as people. "I'm looking at land purchase patterns in the county," she told him, "not for any specific property. I'm trying to understand whether there's been a notable increase in acquisition inquiries over the past 6 to 9 months. Emmett Briggs looked at her over his spectacles. "You're the accountant at Mercer's." "That's right." "He send you?" "He knows I'm here," she said, which was technically accurate. Emmett considered this and then, with the decisive movement of a man who has made his judgment, turned to the filing cabinet behind him. "There's been something," he said. "I wasn't sure what to make of it. 3 separate LLCs, all incorporated in Colorado, all making inquiries or offers on grazing land in this county over the past 8 months. He pulled a folder and set it on the counter. Different names, different representatives. But the registered agent on all 3 is the same Denver law firm. Eleanor looked at the folder. "May I?" "That's public record," he said. She read through it carefully, aware of Emmett watching her face for the reaction that would tell him whether his instinct about the pattern had been right. 3 companies. 14 separate inquiries or offers. Properties ranging from 80 acres to 400, all valued significantly below what Eleanor's instinct and 5 weeks of studying land-adjacent financial records told her they were worth. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "is there anything coming, infrastructure, development, anything that would significantly affect land values in this area?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not supposed to discuss pending county announcements." "Of course," she said. "But there's nothing stopping a person from reading the Regional Development Board minutes from the last quarterly meeting," he said, and moved the folder on the counter approximately 2 inches to reveal a printed bulletin she hadn't seen before. "Which are public record." She read the bulletin. "The Railroad Expansion Project, a spur line from the main trunk, coming through the eastern part of the county. Final route confirmation expected within 3 months. Land values along the corridor. Land values for exactly the kind of flat grazing acreage that Mercer Ranch's eastern pasture represented. Exactly the kind of property that the Kellerman operation and the Fuller family's eastern section and Old Man Dawson's river property represented, would increase dramatically once the announcement was official. Someone knew the announcement was coming. Someone was buying the land before the announcement made the price impossible. Someone named Victor Ashcroft, or someone using 3 differently named companies with the same Denver law firm as their registered agent, was systematically acquiring land at 40 cents on the dollar from people who had no idea what they were about to be sitting on. Eleanor stood at Emmett Briggs's counter for a long moment with the bulletin in her hands and the weight of what she was looking at settling into her chest like cold water. This was not one man stealing from one ranch. This was not the particular greed of a foreman with a long view and patient methods. This was something deliberate and broad and organized, and it had been operating quietly in Red Hollow for the better part of a year, picking off families one by one before they understood what was happening to them. "Mr. Briggs," she said. "Miss Graves. Has anyone else come in asking about land purchase patterns recently?" He thought about it. "A man from Denver," About 2 months ago. Said he was doing research for an investment report. He paused. Polished fellow. Asked to see the same records you just looked at. Did he give a name? He did. Emmett Briggs looked at the ceiling in the way of a man accessing a specific memory. Ashcroft. Victor Ashcroft. She returned the bulletin to its place. Thank you, she said. You've been very helpful. Haven't done a thing, Emmett said pleasantly, except leave some public records sitting out on the counter. She rode back to Mercer Ranch in the failing afternoon light with the old horse picking his own pace along the familiar road and her mind doing the kind of work it did when everything was rearranging itself into a new shape. Garrett Holt's fraud, the renegotiated contracts, the land inquiry letter that had been sitting in the wrong drawer as though it had been placed where it might be found. Victor Ashcroft's visit to the county land office 2 months ago. She didn't know yet how all of it connected. Some of it might not connect. Holt's theft might be entirely separate from Ashcroft's scheme, two opportunists working independently in the same geography. That was possible. It happened. But Eleanor had spent enough years with financial records to know that when a ranch's foreman systematically steals from its operating accounts for 4 years, weakening its financial position, making its owner more vulnerable to unexpected pressure, and a land acquisition company simultaneously begins making below-market offers on that ranch's most valuable land, the probability that those two things are coincidence is very low. The ranch came into view as the light turned orange and flat across the land, and she could see the windows of the main house lit against the coming dark. Silas would be inside. Ruth would be finishing supper. Calhoun and the hands would be in the bunkhouse. She had 30 minutes of light left, and she used them to sit on the fence rail near the horse pen and think, because she had not yet reached the bottom of what she was carrying, and she needed to know the shape of it before she brought it to anyone else. The bottom, when she reached it, was this. One woman with a satchel of financial documentation was not going to be enough to stop what Victor Ashcroft was doing. The documentation she could build would protect Mercer Ranch. It might protect 1 or 2 neighboring operations if she could reach them in time and if they trusted the evidence she brought them. But the pattern was county-wide. The ranchers who'd already sold had already sold. The ones still holding out were doing so without understanding what they were holding, which meant they were still vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure that had convinced them to consider selling in the first place. Fear, urgency, the manufactured belief that the offer in front of them was the best they were going to get. You couldn't fight that one ranch at a time. She climbed down from the fence and led the borrowed horse back to the pen and went inside to tell Silas Mercer that his problems were considerably larger than one dishonest foreman. He was in the study, which was where he was most evenings. The lamp was already lit. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have told him immediately that this was not a routine report, because he sat up straighter without being told to. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself." He leaned forward with his forearms on the desk. "Tell me." She told him everything. She told him about the letter in the wrong drawer, about Emmett Briggs and the 3 Colorado LLCs and the Denver law firm, about the railroad announcement that nobody was supposed to know about, but that someone clearly did. She told him about the Kellerman place and the Fuller section and Dawson's River property. She told him what she suspected about the connection between Holt's long-running fraud and the timing of Ashcroft's land inquiries, and she was careful to separate what she knew from what she suspected, because those were 2 different categories of information, and mixing them was how people made decisions they regretted. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a quality Eleanor was beginning to understand as specific to him. Not passivity, not absence, but the active concentration of someone who is processing rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "If you're right about the railroad," he said, "the eastern pasture alone is worth 3 times what Ashcroft's letter offered, conservatively. And the Kellerman place, they're already talking about selling. Margaret Kellerman told Clara Fontaine last week that they'd received what she called a generous offer, and they were considering it seriously." "How soon?" "I don't know. Weeks, maybe. Margaret said they were taking time to think." Eleanor nodded. "That's time we can use, but not much of it." Silas looked at her across the desk. "What do you need?" It was the same question he'd asked 5 weeks ago when she'd shown him Holt's fraud, and she recognized something in it. Not just the practical reasonableness of a man who responds to information with action, but a specific quality of trust that had built itself incrementally over 40 days of shared difficult work, something that hadn't been purchased and hadn't been given, something that had simply accumulated, the way honest things do. "I need access to your relationship with the other ranchers," she said. "I can build the financial case for every property in this county that Ashcroft has approached. But numbers alone won't convince people who are already scared. They need to hear it from someone they trust." "That's not me," Silas said immediately. "I'm not—" He stopped. "You are," she said. "You may not feel like it, but you've been here your whole life and you don't owe anyone anything, and people in this county know that. When you say something, they know you're not saying it because someone paid you to." He was quiet again. "I also need time," she said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Ashcroft is going to realize eventually that this ranch isn't going to sell, and when he does, he's going to push harder on the ones that might." She met his eyes. "And there's a possibility, I want you to know this, that when he realizes someone is working against him, he's going to try to find out who and why." "Meaning you. Meaning me." Silas looked at her steadily. The lamp made the room feel smaller than it was, and the silence between them had a different quality than the silences at the beginning. Less guarded, less formal. The silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to explain the thing to each other. "I hired you to manage accounts," he said. "I know. This is considerably more than accounts." "Yes." He looked down at the desk for a moment, then back up at her. 2 weeks, he said. "What do you need first?" Eleanor reached into her satchel and put the railroad bulletin on the desk between them, the one Emmett Briggs had left sitting on the counter for her. "I need you to read that," she said, "and then I need you to tell me which of your neighbors you trust most, because that's where we start." Silas named 3 people. He didn't deliberate over the list the way Eleanor had expected him to, the way most people do when asked to identify who they genuinely trust. That slow, painful process of sorting through years of association and deciding which relationships are deep enough to hold weight. He said the names as though he'd already known them before she asked, as though the question had simply unlocked a door that was already there. Thomas Kellerman, B. Fuller, and a man named Roy Dawson, Old Man Dawson's son, who had taken over the river property 3 years ago when his father's health failed and who Silas described as stubborn, suspicious of strangers, and completely honest, which Eleanor took as the highest compliment a Wyoming rancher was likely to produce. "The Kellermans are the most urgent," Silas said. "If Margaret told Clara they're considering the offer seriously, they're probably further along than Margaret let on. Margaret has a habit of understating things she's already decided." "Then we start there," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow morning?" "Tonight, if they'll receive us." Silas looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read as recalibration, the moment when he adjusted his internal picture of what was happening to accommodate something he hadn't anticipated. "I'll send Tate ahead with a note." Thomas Kellerman was 62 years old, a wide-shouldered man who moved like someone who had spent 4 decades doing physical work and whose body had opinions about it now that he generally ignored. His wife Margaret was the kind of woman who listened to everything and said less than half of what she thought, which made her simultaneously easier and harder to read than her husband. They received Silas and Eleanor in the main room of their house with the particular careful hospitality of people who suspected they were about to hear something they didn't want to hear but were too decent to turn away. Eleanor let Silas lead the opening. She had suggested this deliberately, not because she doubted her own ability to establish trust with strangers, but because she understood that the information she was about to give the Kellermans would land differently depending on who delivered it. And in this county, in this community, it needed to come through Silas first. He explained it plainly. No theater, no buildup. He told them about the railroad bulletin, about the 3 Colorado companies with the same Denver law firm, about the pattern of below-market offers across the county. He set the railroad bulletin on the table between them. Thomas Kellerman picked it up and read it slowly. Margaret read it over his shoulder. The room was very quiet for a moment. "The offer we received," Thomas said, "was for 68 cents on the dollar against the appraisal we got last year." "Last year's appraisal didn't account for railroad access," Eleanor said. It was the first time she'd spoken, and both Kellermans looked at her with the focused attention of people hearing a voice that cuts through noise. "With the confirmed spur line, your eastern section alone The flat land along the creek conservatively doubles in value, possibly more depending on where the depot placement lands. You know that for certain? Margaret said. I know the math for certain. The railroad announcement is still pending, so I can't give you a finalized number, but I can show you the regional precedent. She opened her satchel and put 2 documents on the table, comparable sale records from counties where railroad access had been confirmed in the previous decade. These are public records from the county land office. You can verify them yourself. Thomas Kellerman looked at the documents. He looked at Silas. You trust her numbers? Completely, Silas said, without hesitation. Thomas looked back at the documents. Something moved across his face. Anger, Eleanor thought. The specific anger of a person who realizes they've been made to feel grateful for something that was actually a theft. We were going to sign next week, he said quietly. Margaret wanted to take more time, but I thought... He stopped. I thought we were getting a fair deal. You were being made to feel that way deliberately, Eleanor said. That's not the same thing as it being true. Margaret Kellerman made a sound that was not quite a word, a small, controlled exhale that contained everything she wasn't going to say in front of company. She picked up the railroad bulletin and held it like evidence, which it was. What do we do? She said. Eleanor had been thinking about this answer since the ride back from town the previous afternoon. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to any further contact from Ashcroft or any of his companies. And if you're willing, let me show you what the complete financial picture of your property looks like with the railroad factored in. Not so I can tell you what to do with it, so you can make the decision with the real numbers instead of the manufactured ones. Thomas Kellerman looked at his wife. Margaret was still holding the railroad bulletin. Come back Thursday, Margaret said. Bring everything you have. They drove back to Mercer Ranch in the dark with the sounds of the Wyoming night around them, the particular deep quiet of open land that has its own ambient noise if you know how to hear it. And Silas handled the reins with the ease of a man who has driven this road enough times to do it without thinking. That went better than I expected, he said after a while. Margaret was already suspicious, Eleanor said. She just needed something to be suspicious of. How did you know that? She understated how far along they were, Eleanor said. People who are fully comfortable with a decision don't understate it. She was looking for a reason to slow down and didn't have one until tonight. Silas was quiet for a moment. Is that how you read everyone, like a ledger? She thought about that seriously rather than dismissing it. Not like a ledger. Ledgers don't have reasons. People do. I'm usually looking for the gap between what someone says and what their behavior suggests they actually believe. She paused. It's not a comfortable way to pay attention to people. I imagine not. It's useful, though. Yes, he said. I've noticed. The Kellermans were Thursday. B. Fuller was Saturday. Roy Dawson was the following Monday, and he was exactly what Silas had described. A lean, weathered man in his late 30s who met Eleanor at his front door with his arms crossed and his face carrying the preloaded skepticism of someone who has decided in advance to disagree with whatever a stranger is about to say. Silas says you're an accountant, he said, by way of greeting. That's right. What's an accountant doing riding around the county at night talking to ranchers about land values? Finding out who's been lying to them about what their property is worth, Eleanor said. Roy Dawson uncrossed his arms. Not all the way. He left one folded against his chest, but enough to indicate that the conversation had, against his apparent wishes, become interesting. He let them in. The meeting with Roy took longer than the others because Roy argued with every number, which Eleanor did not find frustrating. She found it useful. A person who argues with your evidence is engaging with it, and a person engaging with evidence can be convinced by better evidence. It was the people who didn't argue, who nodded and smiled and said thank you so much, and then went home and did nothing. Those were the ones she couldn't move. By the end of 2 hours, Roy Dawson had reviewed every document she'd brought, disputed 3 of her calculations, been shown why 2 of his disputes were incorrect, and 1 was a legitimate rounding issue. She corrected on the spot, and arrived at his own conclusion through his own reasoning process, which meant the conclusion was his and not something someone had handed him. Ashcroft sent a man out here last month, Roy said. Friendly type. Said he was just exploring interest, no pressure, the offer was open-ended. He was quiet for a moment. He came back 2 weeks ago, less friendly, said the window was closing. That's how pressure campaigns work, Eleanor said. manufacture urgency. Make people feel like they're about to miss the only boat. I told him the window could close all it liked, Roy said. But I told him that because I didn't like his face, not because I had numbers. Now you have numbers. Roy looked at Silas. This woman always talked this straight? From the day I met her, Silas said. Roy looked back at Eleanor with the expression of someone making a final assessment. All right, what do you need from me? What Eleanor needed from all three of them, from Kellerman and Fuller and Dawson, was not just their own decisions, but their reach. Each of them knew other families in the county who had received inquiries or offers. Each of them had relationships that Eleanor and Silas didn't. The information needed to travel through networks that already existed, carried by people who were already trusted, because strangers showing up on doorsteps with financial documents were always going to be a harder sell than neighbors talking to neighbors over fence lines. She explained this, and all three of them understood it, because people who have lived in small communities their whole lives understand intuitively how information actually moves and what gives it weight. By the end of the first week of outreach, Eleanor had briefed 5 families directly and 3 more through the Kellermans and Roy Dawson. She had documents customized for each property, not a generic presentation, but specific analyses showing what each ranch's land was actually worth in the context of the coming railroad, what they'd been offered, and what the difference represented in real terms. She worked on them at night after the ranch's regular bookkeeping was done, because the regular bookkeeping didn't stop needing to happen just because she'd found something larger to worry about. She was sleeping less than 4 hours a night. She knew this was not sustainable and did it anyway, because the timeline had a shape, and the shape was unforgiving. Victor Ashcroft arrived in Red Hollow on a Wednesday. Eleanor didn't see him arrive. She heard about it from Tate, who had ridden into town for supplies, and came back with the particular excited agitation of a 19-year-old who has witnessed something he can feel is important without knowing exactly why. There's a man staying at the Crestwood, Tate said, meaning the county's one respectable hotel. Came in on the morning stage with 2 other men and a lot of luggage. Emmett Briggs's wife told Mrs. Henderson at the dry goods, and Mrs. Henderson told the livery owner, and he stopped himself. The point is, his name is Ashcroft. Eleanor was in the office. She set down her pen. What does he look like? Tall, good suit. Mrs. Henderson said he had the look of someone who'd never done a day's work outdoors, which she meant as an insult, but I think she meant it correctly. Eleanor nodded slowly. Thank you, Tate. He lingered. Is this bad? It means he's moving faster than I expected, she said, which means something spooked him. She thought about it. Or he's on a schedule we don't know about yet. Tate looked at her with 19-year-old earnestness that she found, in spite of everything, genuinely touching. Can I do anything? Keep your ears open in town. Don't ask questions. Questions get noticed. Just listen to what's said around you and tell me. He nodded with the gravity of someone who has just been given a mission and left. Eleanor sat for a moment with the pen still in her hand. Ashcroft's arrival in person was a development she'd anticipated as a possibility, but had hoped to have more time before it materialized. His being here changed the nature of the game. Not the facts, not the evidence, but the pace and the visibility. When the person running a scheme is in the same town as the person working against it, things happen faster and less predictably. She went to find Silas. He was at the corral, talking to Calhoun about something she could tell from their postures was not urgent. She waited until Calhoun peeled off toward the barn, and then said, Ashcroft is in town, staying at the Crestwood. Silas looked at her without visible alarm. When? This morning. He was quiet for a moment, working through something. He'd have heard by now that the Kellermans didn't sign, and Fuller pulled back from the conversation entirely. Roy Dawson told 2 other families directly, word moves here. Yes, Silas said. It does. He looked past her toward the road, then back. He's going to try to find out where the resistance is coming from. He probably already suspects this ranch, Eleanor said. The inquiry letter that was in the wrong drawer, I've been wondering about that since I found it. Someone put it where it might be found. Silas's expression shifted very slightly. Holt. Possibly. Or someone working alongside him who wanted us rattled. If Ashcroft knew Holt's fraud was about to be exposed, putting that letter where I'd find it might have been meant to distract me. Give me something large to look at, so I'd stop looking at the smaller things. but it had the opposite effect. It usually does, she said. With me. The following morning, she received a note at the ranch. It was delivered by a boy from town, not the usual messenger, a different one she didn't recognize, and it was written on hotel stationery, which was a detail she noticed and filed. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the handwriting of someone who had been educated to write impressively and had not forgotten it. Miss Graves, the note read, I understand you have been conducting financial consultations with a number of ranchers in this county. I would very much welcome the opportunity to speak with you at your convenience. I believe we may share certain interests. Victor Ashcroft. Eleanor read the note twice. Then she turned it over and looked at the blank back of it, as though it might contain something the front had left out. She was not afraid of Victor Ashcroft. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because there was a version of this situation in which a person might feel afraid. A single woman, without family nearby, without institutional backing, going up against a man with enough money to employ multiple shell companies and enough connections to know about railroad announcements before they were public. And she had no interest in performing courage she didn't feel. But what she felt was not fear. It was something closer to wariness, the specific alertness of someone who knows they are being assessed by a professional and wants to understand the assessment before responding to it. She showed the note to Silas. He read it and looked up. He knows your name. He wants to know if I can be redirected. She folded the note. He thinks I'm either someone who can be bought or someone who can be warned off. He wants to find out which. And you're going to go. I'm going to go, she confirmed, because the alternative is letting him characterize me without meeting me, and people who haven't met you have a much easier time deciding what you are. Silas was very quiet for a moment. I don't like it. I know. I want Calhoun in town, not at the meeting. Just in town, in case. That's reasonable, she said, which surprised him slightly, because she had not been in the habit of accepting suggestions about her personal safety without at least one counterargument. She was tired enough that she didn't have the energy for it, and honest enough to know Silas wasn't wrong. She met Victor Ashcroft at the Crestwood the following afternoon in the small sitting room off the main lobby that the hotel used for business meetings. He was exactly what Tate's description had suggested. Tall, well-dressed, with a kind of practiced ease that expensive suits and the certainty of inherited advantage tend to produce in men who've never had serious cause to doubt either. His face was pleasant without being memorable. He had the eyes of someone who was always running a quiet calculation, which Eleanor recognized because she'd been told she had the same quality herself. He stood when she came in. He gestured to a chair. He offered coffee, which she declined, and tea, which she also declined, and then he sat down across from her and smiled in a way that was professionally warm and personally empty. Miss Graves, he said, thank you for coming. You asked, she said. I was curious. He studied her for a moment with an air of reassessment that he didn't try very hard to conceal, which told her he was either not as careful as she'd expected or he wanted her to see it as a kind of honesty as strategy. I'll be direct, he said. I understand you've been advising a number of ranchers in this county against accepting land acquisition offers. I've been providing financial information to ranchers who asked for it, she said. What they do with that information is their decision. Of course. He tilted his head slightly. The information you've been sharing includes speculation about a railroad development that hasn't been officially announced. The information I've been sharing includes public records from the county land office and comparable sale data from regional markets, she said. The Regional Development Board minutes from the last quarterly meeting are public record. If the contents of those minutes constitute speculation, that's an interesting definition of the word. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, brief, the flicker of a man recalculating. You're a careful person, he said. I'm an accountant. The offers my clients have made to ranchers in this county are legitimate, he said. They're based on current appraised values. Nobody is being deceived. Current appraised values that don't account for infrastructure development that your clients have specific advanced knowledge of, Eleanor said, which puts them in a very different position during negotiations than the people they're negotiating with. He was quiet for a moment. The pleasant smile hadn't moved, but it had changed quality, thinner, more deliberate. Miss Graves, you're clearly intelligent. You've done impressive work in a short time. He leaned forward slightly. I'm in a position to offer you a role that would make considerably better use of your abilities than managing the books of a struggling cattle ranch. She looked at him. You're offering me a job. I'm suggesting that your skills and your current circumstances may not be optimally matched, he said. I have operations in Denver and Cheyenne in 3 other states. I need people who can read a financial landscape the way you clearly can. And in exchange, Eleanor said, I would stop providing financial information to ranchers in this county. In exchange, he said, you would be working at the level your abilities deserve. The room was quiet. The hotel lobby made small sounds beyond the door. Footsteps, a distant conversation, the ordinary business of people moving through their ordinary day. Eleanor looked at Victor Ashcroft with his careful eyes and his professional warmth and his offer that was dressed like an opportunity and functioned like a threat, and she felt something settle in her. Not dramatically, not with any particular emotion attached to it, just the specific clarity of a person who has looked at a question long enough to know their answer. No, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. I'd encourage you to think carefully. I have thought carefully, she said. I've been thinking carefully for 6 weeks. The answer is no. She stood. Thank you for the meeting. She left without waiting for whatever he'd planned to say next, because she'd learned a long time ago that the best way to end a conversation you've already finished is to simply end it. Calhoun was outside, leaning against the wall of the hardware store across the street, with his hat pulled down and an expression of complete disinterest that fooled no one who knew him. He fell into step beside her without comment, which she appreciated. Well, he said after half a block. He tried to hire me. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. What did you say? No? Another half block. Good, he said. She was almost back to where the horse was tied when she processed the thing that had been sitting at the edge of her attention since the meeting, the thing that hadn't fully surfaced until the conversation was over and the immediate concentration required to navigate it was released. Ashcroft had said my clients. Not my company, not my operation. My clients. She stopped walking. Calhoun stopped too. What? He said clients, she said. He's not the principal. He's operating on behalf of someone else. Calhoun looked at her. Does that matter? It matters because it means the money is coming from somewhere bigger than one Denver investor, she said. It means there are people behind him with more resources than I've been accounting for. She started walking again, faster. It means this county isn't the only place they're doing this. The following days confirmed it. She wrote letters, carefully worded, professionally neutral letters to county land offices in 3 adjacent counties, requesting public records of land acquisition activity over the past 12 months. She framed them as routine comparative research, because routine comparative research doesn't raise alarm in the way that I think someone is running a scheme across multiple counties tends to. 2 of the 3 responses came back within a week. Both confirmed what she'd suspected, the same pattern, different company names, same legal infrastructure, same timing relative to pending infrastructure announcements, same pricing that was always just generous enough to feel like a good deal to people who didn't know what they were actually holding. This wasn't a county-level operation. It was regional. And if it was regional, the county land meeting that Emmett Briggs had mentioned, the quarterly session where development proposals were formally discussed and where Ashcroft's people had apparently been working relationships for months, was not just a local battleground. It was the pivot point for an operation that was much larger than Red Hollow. She brought this to Silas on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after Ashcroft's arrival in town, and she laid it out the same way she always laid things out, plainly, with the evidence in a stack between them, the known on the left and the suspected on the right. He read through everything without speaking. He took longer than usual. When he set the last page down, he didn't speak for a moment, and Eleanor let the silence exist because it was the right kind, a thinking silence, not a deflecting one. The county meeting is in 3 weeks, he said. I know. Ashcroft's going to be there. I know. He's going to have people in that room who are already committed to selling. He's going to have prepared arguments. Silas looked at her. He's also had 2 weeks to find out everything there is to know about you. This was the thing Eleanor had been sitting with in the quiet hours of the night when the ranch was asleep and the numbers on her desk had been set aside. She had no illusions about what a man like Ashcroft could find about her background if he was motivated and resourced. 8 years in Laramie left traces. The merchant she'd worked for, both merchants, were people with their own perspectives on her departure, not all of them generous. There was the situation she'd described to herself as moving too fast that other people might describe differently, depending on who they talked to and what they chose to emphasize. She hadn't told Silas about any of that. It wasn't relevant yet, and she'd learned the hard way that preemptive confessions, however well-intentioned, tend to plant doubts in people's minds that wouldn't have been there otherwise. But if Ashcroft had done his research, and she had to assume he had, it was going to become relevant very soon. "There are things about my history in Laramie," she said carefully, "that someone with motivation and money could use to question my credibility." Silas looked at her steadily. "Tell me." She told him. Not everything. There were things that were hers alone and she'd earned the right to keep them, but the relevant parts. The second merchant in Laramie, a man named Harold Combs, with whom she'd had a professional dispute that had turned personal in the ugly way disputes do when one party decides the cleanest exit is to make the other party look bad. The accusations he'd made, none of them serious enough to hold up under examination, but the kind that stick to a person's name in a small professional community because mud and reputation have a complicated relationship. She told it plainly and without excessive editorializing, because plain was the only way to tell something like that without it becoming either self-pitying or defensive. Silas listened. His expression didn't change in the ways she'd been half-braced for. She'd given this information to one other person in her professional life and watched their face shift into a particular kind of careful neutrality that meant they'd decided something had happened but didn't know what. The worst possible response, because careful neutrality can't be argued with. Silas didn't go careful and neutral. He looked at her and said, "Is any of it true?" "No." "Did you handle the situation imperfectly?" She thought about it. "Yes. I moved too fast. I confronted Combs directly before I'd finished building the documentation, and that gave him time to control the story." "So you made a tactical mistake?" "Yes." "And what Combs said about you afterward?" "Was designed to keep me from working in Laramie again. It mostly worked." She paused. "I came here because Red Hollow was far enough from Laramie that my name didn't carry the freight it carried there." Silas was quiet for a moment. "And if Ashcroft brings this up at the county meeting?" "He won't bring it to the meeting," she said. "He'll circulate it before, through Clara Fontaine or the Henderson women or whoever in this county passes information the fastest. By the time the meeting happens, half the room will already have heard a version of it. And the other half will hear it from the first half before you finish your first sentence." "Yes." Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of working through something he hadn't finished yet. "The evidence you have," he said. "If someone who didn't know you at all, who had only heard Combs's version of your history, if they read what you've put together, could they dispute the numbers?" "No," she said. "The numbers are the numbers. They don't have a reputation." "Then the numbers are what matter at the meeting," he said. "Not you. People don't separate the two as cleanly as that." "Some people don't," he said. "Some people do." He looked at her. "The ones in that room who matter, the ones who haven't already sold, who are still deciding, they're going to look at the evidence and they're going to look at the person presenting it, and I can't promise you they'll manage to keep those two things separate, but I can be in that room." He paused. "And I can make sure they're hearing from someone whose reputation in this county isn't in question." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She was not, by habit, someone who relied on other people to stand in front of her. She had built a practice of self-sufficiency, specifically because relying on other people had, in her experience, generally produced outcomes she hadn't agreed to. The Combs situation was only the most recent version of a pattern that went back further than that. But Silas Mercer was not Harold Combs, and she knew the difference. "There's another problem," she said. She said it because there was always another problem, and the discipline was to name them rather than avoid them. "Ashcroft has been in this county for 2 weeks. He's talked to people. He's made promises and renegotiated offers, and probably had private conversations with 2 or 3 ranchers who were on the fence and are now leaning back towards selling." She looked at him. "We won't know which ones until we're in that room." "Then we prepare for all of them," Silas said. "How?" He was quiet for a moment. "By making sure the people in that room who haven't been reached yet hear the real numbers from someone they trust before Ashcroft gets to speak." He looked at her. Make me a list of every family in this county that's received an inquiry. Every one. I'll spend the next 2 weeks talking to every person on it. That's a lot of talking, she said, for someone who prefers not to. Something moved across his face. The closest thing to amusement she'd seen from him, and it was still not quite that, but it was something in that direction. Yes, well, he said. Apparently I've been letting that preference cost me things. Eleanor picked up her pen. She started the list. Outside the window, the Wyoming night was doing what it always did, spreading itself across the land in that vast, indifferent way, completely unimpressed by the things people were trying to accomplish beneath it. The eastern pasture was invisible in the dark. The railroad that would change its value was still weeks from being announced. Victor Ashcroft was in his hotel room 3 miles away, running his own calculations. And in a small study on Mercer Ranch, an accountant and a rancher sat across a desk from each other, making a list of names, and neither of them said anything about what was coming because they both already knew, and what they needed right now was not words, but work. The list had 22 names on it when she finished. Silas looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, close enough to reach, and Eleanor understood that to mean the conversation was over and the next part had begun. The 2 weeks before the county meeting had a particular texture that Eleanor would remember long after the specific events inside them had blurred. It was the texture of sustained effort without confirmation, working hard toward something with no way to know if it was working, the way you irrigate land in a dry season and watch the sky and do the math on how many more days the roots can hold before the question answers itself one way or the other. Silas worked through the list with a methodical persistence that surprised her. Not because she doubted his commitment, but because commitment and execution are different things, and execution requires a tolerance for repetition and rejection that not everyone possesses in equal measure. He came back from some visits encouraged and from others quiet, in a way that told her more than a report would have. The Braddock family, 4th name on the list, had already signed. That was done. The Harmon widow, 7th name, had listened to everything Silas said, thanked him politely, and told him she would think about it, which in Eleanor's experience of human behavior meant she had already made a decision and was managing the discomfort of delivering it. She's going to sell, Eleanor said, when Silas came back from the Harmon place on a Tuesday evening and described the conversation. I think so too, he said. We can't save everyone. I know that. He sat down at the table with the particular heaviness of a man who knows something intellectually and is still working on knowing it the other way. It doesn't feel good. No, she said. It doesn't. She brought him coffee, which was Ruth's job and not hers, but Ruth had gone to bed an hour ago, and the gesture felt right in the way that small, practical things sometimes feel right when the larger situation is outside your control. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at the table, and she sat across from him, and they didn't talk for a few minutes, which was one of the things she had come to understand about Silas Mercer. He could sit in silence with a person without making the silence into a performance, without filling it with restless movement or manufactured conversation, and she found that quality, which most people would not have listed as a virtue, to be one of the most genuinely restful things about his company. 13 names confirmed, she said after a while. 3 uncertain, 2 lost, and 6 we haven't reached yet. Roy Dawson is handling 2 of those. The Kellermans have the Pratt family. That leaves 4. I'm going to try the Benedicts myself tomorrow, she said, if you'll let me take the brown horse again. He looked up. You don't have to ask permission for the horse. I've been asking. You've been asking because you thought you should. You don't have to. He looked at her steadily. The horse is available to you. The wagon too. Whatever you need. Eleanor looked at him for a moment with the particular attention she gave to things that shifted slightly from where they'd been before. The way a bookkeeper notices a number that's moved without explanation. Not alarmed, just noting. Thank you, she said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. The sounds of a large property at rest, which were not the sounds of silence but the sounds of a living thing breathing. And she thought about the Benedict family and what approach would work best for people she'd never met. And somewhere in the middle of that calculation, she fell asleep. Ashcroft's campaign arrived 3 days before the county meeting, and it arrived the way Eleanor had predicted it would. Not directly, not in a form she could confront or document, but through the social channels of Red Hollow that moved information the way creeks move water, constantly, without effort, following the path of least resistance. She heard the first version from Tate, who'd been in town on Thursday, and come back with the careful expression of someone carrying something uncomfortable. "There's talk," he said, finding her in the office. He stood in the doorway the way he always did when he wasn't sure if he was interrupting, which she'd told him 3 times not to worry about, and which he continued to worry about anyway, being 19 and conscientious. "Tell me." "About you. About before you came here." He was looking at a point approximately 6 inches to the left of her face, which was how Tate looked at people when he was uncomfortable. "People are saying you left Laramie under circumstances, that there was a merchant there who said you manipulated his accounts to cover your own borrowing." Eleanor set her pen down. "And that Silas doesn't know," Tate continued, "and that when he finds out—" He stopped. "I don't know who started it. I just know Mrs. Henderson said it to the livery owner's wife, and the livery owner's wife mentioned it to Calhoun when he was picking up a wheel repair—" "Tate." He stopped. "I know where it came from," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. He started to leave and then turned back. "For what it's worth, I don't believe it." "Why not?" He thought about this with the genuine seriousness he brought to questions he considered important. "Because I've watched you work for 8 weeks, and people who steal money don't spend that much energy finding other people's stolen money. It just doesn't make sense as a personality." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "That is actually a very logical observation." "I'm not just a pretty face," he said, which was so unexpected from him that she almost laughed, and the almost laugh was enough that he grinned and left, and she sat with the warmth of that small exchange for approximately 30 seconds before the problem reasserted itself. She needed to tell Silas. She told him about the Combs situation already, 2 weeks ago, but hearing it from her was different from hearing it circulating in town. And the difference mattered because the county meeting was 3 days away, and she needed to know whether his confidence in her was the kind that holds under social pressure, or the kind that holds right up until the pressure arrives and then quietly changes shape. She found him at the corral again. He seemed to think best near the horses, which she'd noticed without ever commenting on. "The Combs story is in town," she said. He turned from the fence. "Where'd it come from?" "Ashcroft, or someone working for him. It doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is that it's moving." She met his eyes directly. "I need to know how you want to handle it." "How do I want to handle it?" he repeated, as though he was making sure he'd heard the question correctly. "The meeting is in 3 days. Half the people who walk into that room will have heard something about my history in Laramie before they sit down. Whatever credibility I've built here over 8 weeks is going to be competing with whatever version of Harold Combs's story Ashcroft has been circulating." She paused. "You should know that before you decide how much of Monday's presentation rests on your relationship with me versus on the documents themselves." Silas looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the land behind him, that flat gold quality that Wyoming afternoons get in the fall when the angle is low and everything is illuminated from the side rather than above. "Eleanor," he said. It was the second time he'd used her first name without the formal prefix, and the first time he'd done it outside the context of a crisis. She noticed, in the way she noticed things. "I've watched you work for 8 weeks, he said. "I've watched you find fraud that nobody else saw. I've watched you drive yourself into the ground for 2 weeks trying to protect people you've never met. I've watched you turn down a job offer from the man who's trying to take everything these families have." He paused. "I don't need to audit your character. I've been watching it operate." She said nothing for a moment. "But the people in that room?" She started. "The people in that room are going to make their own decisions," he said. "What I can do is stand in front of them and tell them what I've witnessed. That's worth something in this county." Another pause. "Maybe more than it should be, but it's what we have." Eleanor looked at him and felt something shift that she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude felt too small and too one-directional for what was happening, and not relief exactly, because relief implied she'd been more frightened than she'd let herself acknowledge, though perhaps she had been. Something more structural than either, like a load-bearing wall that you've been unconsciously bracing yourself against and then realize has been solid all along. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She spent the next 2 days doing the only thing she knew how to do when everything else was outside her control. She made the documents better. She refined the presentation of the railroad data. She built a comparison table that laid the offered prices alongside the projected post-announcement values in a format that required no financial literacy to understand it. Just eyes and the ability to read two numbers and recognize which one was larger. She wrote plain language summaries for each of the 6 affected properties whose owners would be in that room, so that a person hearing their name could look down at a single page and see their own specific situation rather than a general argument. She was still working at midnight on Sunday when Ruth knocked on the office door and said, without preamble, "Go to bed." Eleanor looked up. You're exhausted and it shows in your face, and tomorrow you need to be the clearest-headed person in that room, which you won't be if you work until 3 in the morning. Ruth crossed her arms. The documents will not improve enough in the next 3 hours to compensate for what it costs you. Eleanor looked at the papers on the desk. Ruth was right. She knew Ruth was right. She had known it for 2 hours and had been working anyway, because the specific anxiety of being prepared is not always responsive to the fact of being prepared. "There's a version of this that doesn't go well," Eleanor said. It came out more directly than she'd intended. The kind of thing you say when you're tired enough that the carefully maintained layer between your thoughts and your words becomes porous. Ruth sat down in the chair across the desk, which she'd never done before. She was a tall woman who sat with the upright posture of someone who had grown up in a household where posture was considered a moral virtue. And she looked at Eleanor with the specific attention of someone deciding to say something they've been holding. "I've worked for Silas Mercer for 11 years, Ruth said. "I worked for his father before him. I have seen this ranch in 3 different kinds of trouble, and I have watched Silas handle all 3 of them by doing the same thing, finding the clearest possible picture of what was real, making his decision, and holding it." She paused. "He's held his decision about you since the 2nd week you were here." Eleanor said nothing. "Go to bed," Ruth said again, but with a different quality. Not instruction now, just something warmer and more straightforward. Eleanor went to bed. The county meeting was held in the main hall of the Red Hollow Civic Building, a square timber structure that smelled of old wood and years of accumulated meetings, and the particular anxious energy of people gathered to make decisions that matter. By 10 o'clock on Monday morning, it was more full than Eleanor had expected. Not standing room, but close. Word about the railroad had been moving, she realized, through channels she hadn't orchestrated, the way word does in small communities when the underlying topic affects enough people. She arrived with Silas and sat to his right at a table near the front. Calhoun was in the back row. Not there as any kind of protection, just there, which was its own kind of statement about allegiance in a place where everyone knew everyone and seating choices were read carefully. Victor Ashcroft was already there when they arrived. He sat on the other side of the room, at his own table, with 2 men she didn't recognize. She assumed lawyers or people performing the function of lawyers. And he looked up when Eleanor came in with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided in advance how he was going to behave in this room. He nodded to her. She returned it without expression. The county land recorder, a man named Albert Fitch, who had the permanent mild anxiety of someone responsible for keeping things official in a context that frequently resisted being official, called the meeting to order at 10:15 and explained the agenda, primarily a discussion of land development proposals and their relationship to the county's infrastructure planning. Ashcroft went first. He had asked to, and Fitch had agreed because Fitch was a man who accommodated requests when he could, and Ashcroft had the kind of manner that made not accommodating seem unreasonably difficult. He spoke well. Eleanor gave him that. He had the particular skill of making complicated things sound simple and self-interested things sound generous, and he laid out the development opportunity. He called it that, an opportunity, with a polish that suggested he had done this before in other rooms and knew which parts to emphasize. He talked about progress, about the railroad's benefit to the whole region, about his client's desire to be partners in that growth, rather than simply extractors of it. He used the word community 4 times. He mentioned fair value twice without ever specifying what fair meant relative to what. Several people in the room were nodding. Eleanor noted which ones. When Ashcroft sat down, Fitch looked at the room and asked if there were other perspectives to be shared, and Silas Mercer stood up. He was not, Eleanor had established over 8 weeks, a natural public speaker. He was too spare with words for the kind of rhetorical momentum that moves crowds, and he had none of Ashcroft's performed warmth. What he had was the attention of every person in that room from the moment he stood, because Silas Mercer had lived in this county his whole life and had never once, in anyone's memory, stood up in a public meeting to say anything. "Most of you know me," he said. "I'm not going to use your time with a long speech because what I have to say doesn't require one." He reached to the table and picked up the stack of documents Eleanor had prepared. "8 weeks ago, I hired an accountant named Eleanor Graves to manage the finances of my ranch. In that time, she found fraud in my own books that I didn't know was there, recovered what she could of the stolen money, and then, because that's apparently what she does, kept looking until she found something bigger." He looked around the room without performance, just the steady watchfulness that was his natural mode. "What she found is in these documents. The railroad bulletin is public record. The land valuation analysis is based on comparable sales from counties where similar announcements have already been made. The list of acquisition offers made in this county, the companies that made them, and the legal firm that connects them. All public record." He set the stacks on the table. "I'm going to ask Miss Graves to walk you through it because she built it and she understands it better than I do, and I think you should hear it from the person who did the work." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment in a particular way, the quietness of people who have just recalibrated something. Eleanor stood. She had prepared for this. She had prepared specifically for the moment when she stood up in this room, because she knew that Ashcroft's background work would be operating in the air, even if nobody named it directly, and she knew the only antidote to that was to be so clear and so specific, and so plainly grounded in verifiable evidence that the question of her character became irrelevant in the way that the question of the weather becomes irrelevant when you have the numbers in front of you. She started with the railroad bulletin. She explained what it meant in plain terms, what a spur line access point did to land values, what the precedent from other counties showed, what the timeline of Ashcroft's acquisition activity looked like relative to when his people had first appeared at the county land office. She set out the 3 Colorado LLCs and the Denver law firm and the pattern of identical timing across the county. She kept her voice level and her pace measured, the way you do when you want people to follow, rather than feel rushed. Halfway through, one of Ashcroft's lawyers stood up and said that the connection between the 3 companies was speculative and potentially libelous. "The registered agent information is available at the Colorado Secretary of State's office," Eleanor said without looking at him. "I've included the document reference at the bottom of page 4. You're welcome to verify it this afternoon." The lawyer sat down. She continued. When she got to the individual property analyses, the ones she'd built specifically so that each affected family could see their own situation, she watched the room change in real time. The Kellermans were in the 3rd row. Thomas Kellerman had his copy before she'd finished the sentence about it, and she watched him read it with the focused attention of a man who has been told something important and is checking whether it matches what he'd suspected. Margaret Kellerman put her hand on her husband's arm when he got to the valuation comparison. Roy Dawson, sitting 4 seats from the Kellermans, read his copy twice and then looked at Ashcroft across the room with an expression that was not particularly pleasant. Eleanor finished. She sat down. The room shifted, that specific group-level shift in energy that happens when a significant number of people simultaneously update their understanding of a situation. It wasn't unanimous. She could see, in the faces of the people who'd been nodding during Ashcroft's presentation, the specific resistance of individuals who had already committed emotionally to a particular conclusion and were now doing the internal work of deciding whether the new information was strong enough to overcome the inertia. Ashcroft stood again. His professional composure was intact. She gave him that. But something underneath it had tightened slightly, the way a well-made garment shows stress at the seams before it tears. "Miss Graves has presented an interesting analysis," he said. "However, I think it's worth noting that Miss Graves's professional history is not without complication." He let that land before continuing. "There are documented disputes from her previous employment in Laramie that raise questions about the reliability of her interpretations. I don't raise this to impugn her personally. I raise it because you are being asked to make significant financial decisions based on analysis from a single source, and due diligence requires understanding the credibility of that source." The room went very still. Eleanor felt the particular sensation of a moment she had been preparing for. Not comfortable, not pleasant, but also not surprising. And there is a specific kind of steadiness that comes from the fact of having anticipated something rather than being ambushed by it. She opened her mouth. Silas stood up before she could speak. He didn't do it quickly or dramatically. He just stood, the way a man stands when he's decided something and doesn't need to announce the decision, and the room looked at him. "Victor," he said, which was the first time he'd addressed Ashcroft directly in the meeting, and the informality of the first name in this formal setting was its own statement. "Miss Graves's professional history isn't on trial here. Your business practices are." He looked at the room, slowly, deliberately, the way you look at people when you want them to understand that you are speaking to them specifically and not to the air. "I've known most of you my whole life. You know I don't have a talent for speeches or persuasion. You also know I don't say things I don't believe." He paused. "I believe Eleanor Graves is the most honest professional I have encountered in 20 years of running a ranch in this county. I believe the documents she has prepared are accurate because I've watched her prepare them and I've verified what I could verify. And I believe that the man standing across this room has been systematically deceiving your families about the value of what you own." Another pause, shorter this time. "You can look at the numbers and reach your own conclusions. That's what they're there for. But I'm not going to stand here and let her credibility be the subject of this meeting when it is not the subject of this meeting." He sat down. Something happened in the room that Eleanor had no precise word for. Not applause, nothing so dramatic as that. More like a collective release of held breath, or the sound of a decision being made at the level of atmosphere rather than individual voice. Ashcroft looked at Silas across the room for a moment with the expression of a man who has just recalculated and doesn't like the result. Then he looked at Eleanor with something that was not quite anger but was the professional residue of it. The focused attention of someone who has been thwarted and is already thinking about what comes next. "The analysis in these documents," Ashcroft said, in the careful tone of a man recovering his footing, "is projecting values based on an announcement that has not yet been made. You're being asked to make present-day decisions based on speculation about the future." "The Regional Development Board minutes are dated," Eleanor said. She kept her voice even. "The route confirmation is expected within 60 days. The comparable sales I've cited are from counties where the announcement had not yet been made at the time of sale, which is precisely the point. The families who sold before the announcement in those counties received between 40 and 60% of the value they would have received 60 days later. That's not speculation. That's a documented pattern available to anyone who requests the county records. Patterns aren't guarantees. Nothing in finance is a guarantee," she said. "But patterns are what we use to distinguish between reasonable decisions and manipulated ones. The pattern here is clear." Thomas Kellerman's voice came from the third row, unexpected, unhurried. "I was going to sign last week," he said, to the room rather than to anyone specifically. "We decided. Margaret wanted more time, but I thought we had enough information." He held up the document Eleanor had prepared for his property. "This is the difference between what we were offered and what this land will be worth in 60 days. I'm not a financial man, but I can read two numbers." He set it back down. "We're not signing." A silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then a woman's voice from the left side of the room, Eleanor didn't know her, one of the faces she'd only seen today, said, "We got an offer last month. We were told the window was closing." A pause. "Is there a document for the Weston property?" "Page 7, Eleanor said. The sound of papers moving through the room. Ashcroft remained standing. His two lawyers were leaning together, speaking in low voices. His professional composure was intact, but it had changed character. From the composure of someone in control to the composure of someone managing a situation that had moved outside control. Eleanor had seen that specific transition in the faces of other men in other rooms. It was not a pleasant thing to witness exactly, but there was something real in it. The moment when a carefully constructed artifice encounters actual resistance and the actual resistance wins. Roy Dawson said, from somewhere in the middle of the room, "What happens to the families that already sold?" Eleanor had thought about this question and had not found a clean answer for it, which was the honest situation. "The sales that have already completed are legal transactions," she said. "The families who sold can seek counsel about whether the non-disclosure of the railroad development constitutes grounds for any kind of relief. I'm not a lawyer, and I can't advise on that. What I can tell you is that the documentation I've built covers the full pattern, and that documentation is available to anyone who needs it for any purpose." It was not a satisfying answer. She knew that. The Harmon widow, wherever she was, had probably already signed by now, and the Braddock family had definitely already signed. And the truth of this situation was that not everyone was going to be protected because not everyone could be protected after the fact. Eleanor was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. "That's honest," Roy Dawson said, in a tone that suggested he'd been testing for exactly that. Ashcroft made 2 more attempts to recover the room. The first was a recapitulation of his original argument, framed more urgently, with emphasis on the risks of waiting and the benefits of the development partnership his clients offered. The second was a direct appeal to the people he'd spent 2 weeks cultivating. There were 3 families in the room who he'd had private conversations with, Eleanor was fairly certain, and he directed his final argument specifically toward the concerns she imagined he'd heard from each of them. Neither attempt moved the room the way he needed it to. The energy had shifted in that irreversible way that happens when enough people in a shared space have updated their understanding at roughly the same time. It wasn't that everyone was convinced. She could see uncertainty in several faces and calculation in others. But the clean certainty that Ashcroft had walked into the room with was gone, and in its absence the documents on the table were the most solid thing available. Albert Fitch, who had been managing the meeting with the expression of a man navigating a river in flood, called a formal break at 11:45. During the break, Eleanor stood at the table and answered questions from the families who came to her with the specific directness of people who have decided to trust someone and want to move quickly now that the decision is made. The Weston woman, her name was Ada, Eleanor learned, and she had 3 grown children and a river bottom section that was, by Eleanor's calculation, among the most valuable parcels in the entire affected area, stood across the table with her copy of Eleanor's analysis and said, "If I refuse the offer, what leverage do I actually have?" "Your land," Eleanor said. "That's the only leverage you need. Once the railroad announcement is official, the buyers come to you. You don't go to them. And until then? Until then, you hold." She met Ada Weston's eyes. "They need you to sell before the announcement. After it, the price is set by the market, and they can't control it. Waiting is the power." Ada Weston looked at the documents. Then she looked at Eleanor with an evaluating directness that reminded Eleanor unexpectedly of Ruth. "Silas Mercer's been alone a long time," she said, which appeared to have nothing to do with anything they'd been discussing. Eleanor blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Just an observation," Ada said, and picked up her papers and moved away. Eleanor stood for a moment processing that and decided not to. When the meeting reconvened, 3 families withdrew their pending agreements with Ashcroft's companies. One family, the one she'd been least sure about, a younger couple named Carr, who'd received the largest individual offer and had the least land to wait with, said they needed more time, which in this context was a victory of sorts because more time meant not signing today. Ashcroft did not storm out. He did not make threats. He gathered his papers and his 2 lawyers, and he left with the calibrated dignity of a man who has prepared for multiple outcomes and is now executing the one he liked least. At the door, he paused. He looked back at Eleanor across the emptying room, and the look was not angry. It was something more specific and less emotional, the look of a man filing information. She held it without flinching. He left. Silas was beside her when she turned from the door, close enough that she registered the warmth of him without quite expecting it, and he looked tired in the particular way of someone who has spent a great deal of energy on something that mattered and is not yet sure if it was enough. 3 withdrawals, she said. "And the cars will come around," he said. "Give them a week." "You don't know that." "I know Jonas Carr. He'll do the math 3 more times, decide the same thing each time, and then act on it." He paused. "The math you gave him is clear." Eleanor gathered her documents. Around them, people were talking in the way a room talks after something significant, louder than before, more animated, the specific social energy of shared experience being processed. Several people came by to thank her, and she accepted the thanks simply without deflecting, because deflecting thanks is its own kind of dishonesty. Thomas Kellerman shook her hand with both of his, which was the handshake of a man who means it rather than performing it. "Come out to the ranch sometime," he said. "Margaret would like to feed you." "I'd like that," Eleanor said, and meant it, which was something she hadn't expected to mean when she arrived in Red Hollow 8 weeks ago with a worn satchel and 60-day contract terms she'd drafted herself. Roy Dawson left without speaking to her directly, which she'd expected. He gave Silas a single nod on his way out that seemed to communicate something specific between them, and Silas returned it. The hall emptied. Albert Fitch collected the formal meeting records with the relieved efficiency of a man whose hardest job is over. The last of the afternoon light was coming through the high windows at the angle that means 3 o'clock. Eleanor and Silas walked out to the wagon in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the aftermath with words. The town around them was going about its ordinary business with the complete indifference of ordinary business to extraordinary events, which was either comforting or strange, depending on how you held it. She put her satchel in the wagon bed and climbed up, and Silas released the horse from the post and came around and got up beside her, and they sat for a moment before he gathered the reins. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "He'll adjust and try again. Different approach, maybe different company names. The cars are still exposed." "Yes." "And Ashcroft's principals, whoever is behind him, they don't lose interest in a project this size because one county meeting went badly." "No," Silas said, "they don't." She looked at the main street of Red Hollow, at the buildings and the people and the ordinary afternoon proceeding along its ordinary lines. And she thought about the list of 22 names that was now mostly resolved, and about the 3 families in adjacent counties whose land records she'd requested and who had probably been contacted by similar companies with similar offers, and who didn't know Eleanor Graves and had no reason to trust her and might never hear what had happened in this room today. "The documentation I built," she said. "It should go to the county land recorder formally, on record. I'll arrange it. And Emmett Briggs should have a copy. He'll know what to do with it. All right?" A pause. "The pattern is big enough that it should probably go to someone above the county level," she said. "A territorial official, someone with the reach to look at all 3 counties at once." Silas looked at her sideways. "That's outside what you were hired to do." "I know. Also outside what you agreed to when you drafted those 60-day contract terms." "I know," she said again. He held the reins without moving the horse. The afternoon sat around them, patient and indifferent. "My 60 days are up in 4 days, Eleanor said. It was the first time she'd said it aloud to him directly, though she knew he knew the date. She'd known he knew it the way you know when someone is aware of a thing without their having mentioned it, from the particular way they don't mention it. "I know," he said. "I don't have a plan for after," she said, which was true, and which was a more honest thing to say than several other things she might have said that were also true. Silas picked up the reins. The horse moved forward, and the wagon rolled out of town along the road toward Mercer Ranch, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the silence had the particular quality that Eleanor had learned to recognize as the specific silence of 2 people thinking about the same thing from different sides. She watched the land unroll alongside the road, the flat sections and the slight rises and the distant line of hills that marked the edge of the county. And she thought about how 8 weeks ago she had been sitting at a hiring table at a stock fair, looking at a notice that was 2 weeks stale, and now she was here, in this wagon, on this road, with more unfinished business than she'd had when she arrived, and the strange, complicated sensation of not being ready for it to end. The ranch came into view as the road curved, and the eastern pasture caught the late light the way it always did, and Eleanor looked at it and thought about the railroad that was coming, and about what that land would mean in 60 days, and about how the man sitting beside her had defended her in front of a room full of people without being asked and without hesitating. She thought about what Ruth had said. She thought about Ada Weston's non sequitur at the break. She thought about the 60-day contract in her satchel and the 4 days left on it. Then she thought about the territorial official she needed to write to, and the Carr family's unresolved situation, and the documentation that still needed to be filed, and the work that was still very much not finished. She realized, thinking about staying. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was also true. Not because the work required it, though that was also true. But because Red Hollow, against every reasonable expectation she'd had when she rode into it on a borrowed horse, with a drafted contract and no particular hope, had turned into something she didn't have a clean word for yet. She was still working on the word when Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the house, and Ruth appeared at the door with the expression of someone who'd been watching for them, and the ordinary life of the ranch resumed around the extraordinary thing that had just happened in town, the way ordinary life always does. The 4 days passed the way the last days of something always pass.
too quickly in the parts you wanted to slow down, and too slowly in the parts you were dreading. Eleanor filed the documentation with Albert Fitch on Tuesday morning, formally and on record, with copies made and witnessed. Emmett Briggs received his copy the same afternoon and read it at his counter while she stood there, turning pages with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and what it meant for the county's land records going forward. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. When he finished, he set the last page down and said, "This should have been caught sooner." And Eleanor said, "Yes." And he said, "I'll make sure it goes where it needs to go." And that was the entirety of it, which was exactly the right length for that conversation. She wrote the letter to the Territorial Land Office on Wednesday. It took 3 drafts, not because she didn't know what to say, but because the register mattered enormously. Too aggressive, and it would be dismissed as a complaint from someone with a personal grievance. Too measured, and the urgency would be lost in the language.
The 3rd draft landed where she wanted it, factual, specific, with the supporting documentation referenced by page number and available on request. She described the pattern across 3 counties without editorial commentary, because the pattern described itself if you gave it room to. Silas read it before she sent it. He read it standing at the kitchen table in the early morning while Ruth was making coffee and the ranch was waking up around them. And when he finished, he set it down and said, "It's good." Just that. But the way he said it carried the particular weight of someone who does not offer assessment carelessly. She sent it Wednesday afternoon. Thursday was the last day of the contract. She had not packed her bag. She was aware of not having packed it the same way you are aware of an unfinished task that you keep finding reasons not to complete, not forgetting it exactly, just not doing it. The bag sat on the chair in the corner of her room in the same state it had been in for 8 weeks, organized but not assembled for travel. And every morning she looked at it, and every morning she turned to the desk instead. On Thursday morning, Silas knocked on the office doorframe at 8 o'clock, the hour she'd been arriving to work since the first week. And she looked up from a payroll reconciliation she was finishing because the payroll reconciliation needed finishing, and she was not going to leave it incomplete regardless of what the day was, and he stood there with his hat in his hands in the way that men hold hats when they're doing something they're slightly uncomfortable with. "Your contract ends today," he said. "I know. I want to offer you a permanent position." She set her pen down. She had known this was coming, had known it with the particular certainty of someone who has been paying attention, and she had spent a portion of each of the preceding 4 nights working out how she felt about it, and had arrived at a feeling that was complicated in the specific way that things you want but are not sure you deserve tend to be complicated. "As an accountant," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the watchful directness she'd long stopped finding difficult to hold. "As whatever you want to call it," he said, "the ranch needs you, the books need you, whatever the next problem is that we haven't found yet, needs you." A pause that had something in it she recognized but was not going to name yet. "I need you." The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where something important is being said plainly. "There's a version of this," Eleanor said carefully, "where I stay, and it's professionally straightforward. A permanent accountant arrangement with a negotiated rate and clear responsibilities." "Yes," he said, "and there's a version where it's more complicated than that." "Yes," he said again. He was not going to pretend he didn't know what she meant, which was one of the things about him she had come to trust most. He didn't perform confusion to avoid a conversation. "I've been in one place 8 weeks," she said. "I've spent 8 years moving between positions. I don't know how to—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not easy to live with. I work too many hours and I say things more directly than people generally want, and I'm bad at asking for help even when I need it." "I know," he said. "You know 8 weeks of it." 8 very concentrated weeks," he said. "I've watched you handle more in 8 weeks than most people handle in a year, and I've watched how you do it, and I know what kind of person that is." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'm also not easy to live with. I don't talk enough. I hold things inside past the point where I should let them out. I've been told, by someone who knew me well, that I am somewhere else even when I'm standing right in front of a person." "Catherine," Eleanor said. He looked at her slightly sharply. "Ruth mentioned it, not maliciously, just as context." He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about what she said for 13 years. She wasn't wrong. People can change things about themselves." "Not all things," he said honestly. "Not completely." I'm still going to go quiet sometimes when I should speak. You're still going to work too late and say things that cut straight to the bone of a situation without cushioning." He paused. "But I think those particular failures might be more compatible with each other than most." Eleanor looked at the man standing in her office doorway with his hat in his hands and 13 years of closed doors behind him. And she thought about the night he'd stood up in a meeting room in front of the entire county and defended her without hesitation and without being asked. And she thought about the list of 22 names he'd carried in his shirt pocket and worked through one by one on his own time. And she thought about the silence between them on the wagon ride home that had felt like the most honest conversation she'd had in years. She also thought about Harold Combs and Laramie, and the way she'd believed she was safe in that position right up until she wasn't, and the 6 weeks of searching that had brought her to a hiring table at a stock fair reading a 2-week-old notice. She was not someone who trusted easily. She knew that about herself with the same clarity she brought to other assessments. The trust she had for Silas Mercer had built itself one specific action at a time over 8 weeks, and it was real, and it was earned, and it still required something from her that did not come naturally: the decision to act on it. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right, which version?" "The complicated one," she said. Something happened in his face that she hadn't seen before and that she did not have language for yet. Something that was relief and something that was more than relief. Something that had been waiting a long time to be where it was and knew it and was trying not to show it and wasn't entirely succeeding. He was not a man who expressed things easily, and watching him try was its own kind of communication. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on and turned to leave, and then turned back with the specific movement of a man who has remembered something important. "The payroll reconciliation you're finishing. Almost done. There's no deadline on it today." "There's always a deadline on payroll." He almost smiled. "No, there isn't. Not today." He looked at her steadily. "Put the pen down, Eleanor. The numbers will be here tomorrow." She looked at the reconciliation. She looked at the pen in her hand. She put the pen down. He nodded once and left, and she heard his boots cross the hall toward the back of the house. And she sat for a moment in the office that smelled of paper and numbers and 8 weeks of work, and she felt something that took her a moment to identify because she had not felt it in a long time. She felt like she was where she was supposed to be. She was careful with that feeling. She didn't trust it completely because feelings of that kind have a way of resolving into something different once the extraordinary circumstances that produced them settle back into ordinary life. She had seen that happen to other people and had always assumed she was too clear-eyed to let it happen to her, which was probably the thing that made her most susceptible to it. But she was also 31 years old and had spent 8 years developing a very precise understanding of the difference between something that looked right and something that was right. And what she felt in that office on the last day of her 60-day contract had the specific quality of the second kind. She left the reconciliation on the desk and went to find Ruth. Ruth was in the kitchen doing what Ruth always did at that hour, managing the morning with the efficient authority of someone who has had long practice at running a household and expects it to cooperate. She looked up when Eleanor came in and assessed the situation with the perceptiveness that Eleanor had come to understand was simply Ruth's default mode of engagement. "You're staying," Ruth said. Not a question. "Yes." Ruth turned back to the stove. "Good. I was going to have to completely revise my opinion of his judgment if you left." Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table, which she didn't usually do at this hour. "Ruth, when you told me about Catherine, you said Silas held things inside too long." "I did. Do you think he's changed that, or just adapted to it?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, stirring something with the concentration of a woman deciding how honest to be. "I think," she said finally, "that he started changing it about 8 weeks ago. Whether it sticks is up to both of you." She looked over her shoulder. "Which is true of everything worth having." Eleanor absorbed that. "Also," Ruth said, setting a cup on the table without being asked, "you work too hard and don't eat enough breakfast, and if you're going to be here permanently, I'm going to require you to address both of those things." "That sounds like a negotiation." "It's not a negotiation," Ruth said pleasantly. "It's information." The following weeks had their own rhythm, different from the preceding 8. Less urgent, less driven by the specific pressure of a deadline or a crisis, which meant Eleanor had to relearn how to work at a pace that wasn't emergency pace, which turned out to be harder than she'd expected. She was used to moving fast because there was always something pressing at her back. With the immediate crises resolved, the pressing thing was gone, and the absence of it left a space she didn't quite know what to do with at first. She filled part of it with the work that still needed doing. The territorial letter had generated a response within 2 weeks, a formal inquiry from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, requesting the full documentation she'd compiled. She organized and sent it, and followed up twice, and by the end of the 3rd week there was a formal investigation underway into the acquisition pattern across all 3 counties. Ashcroft had left Red Hollow 3 days after the county meeting. His departure was noted by Emmett Briggs, who mentioned it to Tate, who mentioned it to Eleanor, who noted it without particular satisfaction. His leaving didn't close anything. The investigation would take time. The principals behind him, whoever they were, the clients he'd mentioned at their meeting, were not going to be inconvenienced by one county's resistance. They would recalibrate and try again somewhere else, in some other form. And the best Eleanor could do about that was make sure the documentation she'd built was thorough enough to be useful to whoever encountered the pattern next. She added a summary document to the file, not asked to, not paid extra for it, just the particular compulsion of someone who cannot leave a job half done. That described the methodology of the scheme in clear terms, what to look for, what the warning signs were, how the timing of acquisition attempts related to pending infrastructure announcements. She made it readable for people who were not accountants. She gave a copy to Emmett Briggs and one to the territorial office and one to the land recorder in each of the 3 affected counties. Then she let it go, because you can only do what you can do, and the rest belongs to other people in other circumstances, and you have to trust that the work you did was solid enough to be useful when it's needed. The Carr family came around in 10 days, as Silas had predicted. Jonas Carr made the decision the same way Silas said he would, by doing the math 3 more times and arriving at the same answer each time. And when he declined Ashcroft's offer formally through the county recorder's office, he sent Eleanor a note that said simply, "Thank you for the numbers." She pinned it to the wall above her desk, which was the only decoration she'd added to the office in 2 months. Ada Weston's river bottom land, when the railroad announcement came official 6 weeks later, was appraised at 2.5 times the offer she'd been made. She came to Mercer Ranch in person to tell Eleanor, which Eleanor had not expected, and stood in the office doorway with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her and said, "I want you to know that because of what you did, my grandchildren have an inheritance." She didn't wait for a response. She left the way she'd come in, purposefully, as though she'd completed an errand she'd had on her list. Eleanor sat with that for a while. The railroad announcement changed the county in the specific way large infrastructure changes things, suddenly and unevenly, and with winners and losers distributed not entirely in proportion to what anyone had done to deserve their outcome. The families that had held kept their land and found themselves, within a season, in a dramatically different financial position than they'd been in 8 weeks earlier. The families that had sold before the announcement had sold, and that was done, and some of them adjusted to it better than others. The Braddock family sold and bought a smaller operation 2 counties over with the proceeds. Eleanor heard this from Thomas Kellerman and thought about it, whether they'd made the best decision available to them at the time with the information they had, which they had, and whether it would have been different if she'd reached them sooner, which she didn't know and couldn't resolve. The Harmon widow received a letter from a lawyer in Cheyenne about potential redress under territorial property law. Whether anything came of it, Eleanor didn't know yet. These were the imperfect edges of a situation that had never had a clean shape. She had learned, slowly and against her inclination, to hold the incomplete parts without trying to force resolution on them. Some things don't resolve. Some harm is done and stays done. You do the work you can do and you accept the limits of your reach, and accepting those limits is its own kind of discipline that Eleanor was still practicing and would probably practice for a long time. Silas gave her the permanent position with a negotiated rate that she argued was too high and that he refused to lower, citing the concept of appropriate compensation for documented value delivered, which was the most she'd ever heard him say in one breath about money, and which she suspected he'd been preparing. She moved her things from the small room off the hall to the larger room at the corner of the house, which had 2 windows and better light, and which Ruth had been keeping in a state of preparedness that suggested she'd been expecting the move for some time. The relationship between her and Silas did not transform overnight into something different from what it had been. It didn't work that way, and she was glad it didn't, because things that transform overnight tend to be performances rather than the real adjustment of two people's lives to accommodate each other. What happened instead was slower and more honest, a gradual accumulation of small moments that changed the texture of the daily life they were building in the same space. He started talking more, not dramatically, not into territory that felt foreign to his character, but incrementally, sharing the small observations and concerns that he'd previously processed alone, asking her opinion on things outside her professional purview, telling her things about the ranch's history and about the county and about his own history that weren't necessary to share, but that he chose to share. She understood this as something that cost him something, and she treated it accordingly. She, for her part, started leaving the office before 9 o'clock at night, which Ruth noted approvingly, and Tate found so remarkable that he mentioned it twice. She learned to bring problems to Silas before she'd already solved them, which required the specific discipline of asking for input before you know the answer and being willing to have the other person's reasoning change yours. She was not consistently good at this. She improved. They disagreed about things, not small things. People who get along too easily on the small things are usually avoiding the real ones. They disagreed about a contract negotiation in October that Eleanor thought Silas handled too cautiously, and Silas thought Eleanor pushed too hard, and they had a conversation about it that was direct enough to be uncomfortable and honest enough to be useful. And they came out the other side of it with a position that was better than either of them had reached alone. This seemed important to Eleanor. Not that they agreed, but that they could disagree without either of them going somewhere unreachable. She had lived with Harold Combs's version of professional disagreement, which had taught her what it looked like when the gap was too wide to bridge. The gap between her and Silas was nothing like that. It was the ordinary gap of two people with different instincts and different histories trying to work in the same direction. And ordinary gaps are navigable when the people on either side of them are willing to. Winter came to Red Hollow with the particular commitment that Wyoming winters bring, not gradually, but all at once, as though the season had been making preparations you didn't notice and then simply arrived with everything ready. The ranch adapted, the way it always adapted, and Eleanor adapted with it, learning the rhythms of a working operation through cold months in a way she'd never had occasion to learn before. She had thought, before she came here, that she understood what a cattle ranch was. She had understood it the way you understand a thing from the outside. The general shape, the basic functions, the financial structure. 8 months of living inside one had given her a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge that only comes from being present through the seasons and the problems and the daily particulars that don't appear in any ledger. She understood by December why Silas went quiet sometimes. The ranch required a particular quality of attention, not the analytical attention she was used to, but the kind of sustained environmental awareness that comes from being responsible for a large living system that has its own demands and its own schedule and cannot be reasoned with. She had watched him notice things she couldn't have noticed, a shift in an animal's behavior, a change in the land's condition, something in the air that meant weather was coming. And she understood that the apparent distance he sometimes inhabited was not absence. It was that quality of attention turned inward. Catherine had experienced it as indifference. Eleanor experienced it as a different kind of presence. People perceive the same things differently, she thought. That's not a moral failure of either party. It's just the specific way that two people's needs and two people's habits either fit together or they don't. And the question is never whether someone is a good person. The question is whether who you are fits with who they are in the particular shape your life together requires. She thought about this more than she'd expected to. She had spent her professional life analyzing financial compatibility, whether an operation's costs fit its revenue, whether its structure could support its ambitions, and she found, to her private amusement, that personal compatibility followed similar logic. You were looking for fit, not perfection. You were looking for a structure that could hold weight over time. What she had with Silas could hold weight. She was increasingly certain of this in the specific way she was certain of things that she'd checked enough times to stop doubting. It was in late February, when the worst of the winter had passed, but the cold was still serious, and the land still had the particular blankness of waiting, that Silas said what he'd been building toward saying for longer than either of them had named. They were outside near the old cottonwood that stood at the edge of the east pasture. She'd gone out because she needed air, and he'd followed without being asked, which was a new habit of his, the quiet following. And the light was doing its winter thing, flat and pale and without shadows, the kind of light that makes everything look like a draft of itself rather than the finished version. He said, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask." "I need a minute." She waited. She had gotten better at waiting. He looked at the east pasture, the land that had been almost taken from him, the land that, because of what Eleanor had done, was now worth more than it had been when she arrived. He'd never said that directly to her, and she'd never pointed it out, because financial outcomes are a side effect of right action, not the reason for it. "I spent 13 years," he said, "deciding that the most sensible thing was to stop expecting anything from that direction, from the person direction, the expecting someone to stay direction." He was having difficulty with this, she could hear it, and she did not help him by speaking because he needed to get there himself. "And then you sat down across from me in a study and told me the truth about something I didn't want to know, and then kept doing that. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped being able to imagine this place without you in it." The cottonwood behind them had the still quality of old trees and cold air, patient in the way only. Very old things are patient. "I'm not asking you to marry me because the ranch needs you," he said. "I need to be clear about that. The ranch needed an accountant. He stopped. "I'm asking you because I would rather disagree with you about contract negotiations every month for the rest of my life than not have you here." Eleanor looked at the east pasture. She thought about the stock fair where she'd walked past him without looking. She thought about the 2-week-old notice on the hiring board. She thought about the small office that smelled of old paper, and the first ledger she'd opened, and the long nights working through numbers that told a story nobody else had read. She thought about what she'd said to Silas in the very first week, without meaning to say it plainly. "I don't have anything to lose yet." She had things to lose now. That was the difference. That was the thing she'd been sitting with since October. That particular exposure of someone who has built something real and knows what it would mean to lose it. She had spent 8 years keeping herself light enough to move, because light things don't lose much when they fall. She had put down roots here without meaning to, and the roots had taken, and the question was whether she was going to pretend otherwise or tell the truth. She told the truth. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes," she said again, simply. "I'll marry you." He let out a breath that had been held for longer than this conversation. She heard it and recognized it as the kind of release that happens when something that has been braced for a long time is finally allowed to rest. He reached out and took her hand, which he'd never done before. And his hand was large and calloused and warm, and she held it with the specific firmness of a person who has decided and is not going back. They stood there for a while, the east pasture spread out in front of them, pale and waiting for spring. The old cottonwood held its ground behind them the way old things hold their ground. The cold air had that clean quality that winter mornings have when the wind has stopped and everything is very still and the world seems to be paying attention. Neither of them said anything for a while, because some things are complete without being narrated. They were married in April, when the land had come back to itself, and the cottonwood had leaves again, and the east pasture was green with the particular green of spring grass after a long winter. Not the dramatic green of somewhere wetter, but the precise, hard-won green of land that knows how to be patient. The wedding was small. Thomas and Margaret Kellerman came. Roy Dawson came and shook Eleanor's hand once and said, "Good," which was the entirety of his toast. Ada Weston came and brought her eldest daughter. Calhoun wore a different hat than usual, which was as dressed up as he was going to get, and he told Eleanor before the ceremony that he was sorry about the fence post comment, and she told him she'd heard worse and meant it in the kindest possible way. Ruth cooked everything, refusing assistance with a determination that suggested assistance would not be tolerated, and the food was extraordinary in the way that Ruth's cooking was always extraordinary, which was the way of someone who has never phoned it in once in 40 years of feeding people. Tate stood at the back and looked slightly overcome, which was characteristic of him, and which Eleanor found, as she found most of his characteristics, genuinely endearing. The ceremony was conducted by the county judge, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had been the county's first female judge for 3 years, and who performed the ceremony with the brisk warmth of someone who takes the institution seriously without taking herself too seriously, which Eleanor appreciated. When it was done, and the afternoon went on around them in the ordinary way that afternoons go on, full of food and conversation and the specific good noise of people who like each other in the same space, and Eleanor stood at the edge of it. Not quite in it, not quite out of it, which was where she tended to stand at social events, and watched it and felt the weight of it, and did not try to reduce it to something manageable. The territorial investigation concluded in June. It took longer than Eleanor had hoped, and produced less than she'd argued for in her documentation, which was the typical outcome of institutional processes when the people under investigation have resources and lawyers of their own. 2 of Ashcroft's 3 Colorado companies were formally dissolved. Victor Ashcroft was required to pay restitution to 3 families in the adjacent counties, whose sales the investigation determined had been conducted under demonstrably false information. The amount was a fraction of what he'd made. He did not return to Red Hollow. Eleanor received the investigation's closing report on a Tuesday and read it at her desk in the corner office that now had both windows open to the June air and the Tate note still pinned above the desk alongside 3 others she'd added. And she set the report down when she finished and sat for a long moment with the specific feeling of a resolution that was partial and real and had to be enough. The Harmon widows' case was still pending. Eleanor had corresponded with the lawyer in Cheyenne twice more, providing additional documentation, and the case had a shape that might eventually produce something. She didn't know yet. These were the things that stayed incomplete. She had filed them in the place she kept things that weren't finished and might not be, not forgotten, not obsessed over, just held lightly and checked on periodically. It was a practice. She was still learning it. What she had learned over the course of a year in Red Hollow was something she would not have predicted when she walked into it. She had spent 8 years being good at her work and using that competence as the primary thing she offered the world, the thing that justified her presence in any given place, the credential that preceded everything else. She was an accountant. She found what was wrong. She fixed what she could fix. She moved when the work was done. The thing she had not expected was that being seen clearly by another person, not your competence, not your usefulness, but you, was an entirely different experience than being respected for your work, and that the difference mattered in ways she hadn't been willing to examine because examining it required admitting she'd been lonely. She'd been lonely for years. She'd been so efficiently, productively lonely that she'd mostly managed not to notice. Silas Mercer, who communicated in silences more than sentences, and whose best quality was that he paid attention without agenda, had noticed what she was before she was ready to tell him, and he had treated it with the specific care of someone handling something valuable. She thought about this sometimes, not in the grand way of people who've made their peace with a thing, but in the ordinary way of someone who revisits an idea because it keeps yielding something new. The people nobody pays attention to carry the clearest view of what's actually happening. She had always known this professionally. She had not fully understood it personally until it applied to her. By late summer, Mercer Ranch had recovered the operating losses that Holt's fraud had accumulated over 4 years. Not all at once. That was not how financial recovery worked, and Eleanor was not in the business of pretending otherwise. But steadily, through a combination of renegotiated contracts, recovered payroll efficiency, 2 new cattle sale agreements she'd brokered using the county's improved market position post-railroad, and the particular compounding effect of a well-run operation that simply stops bleeding. The East Pasture's value, which had been the potential prize in Ashcroft's scheme, became the foundation of a 20-year land note that Silas used to fund 2 operational improvements he'd been deferring for a decade. The railroad access changed the economics of the region in the specific way that infrastructure always changes economics. Not equally, not fairly, but substantially, and the families that had held their land were substantially better off than they'd been 12 months earlier. Thomas Kellerman stopped Eleanor in town one September afternoon and said, without preamble, "We paid off the mortgage." He said it the way a man says something he's been waiting a long time to say. She told him that was good news and meant it completely. Roy Dawson never said thank you. He said, when she ran into him at the county land office in October, "The Pratt family's thinking about expanding their north section. You might want to look at their numbers." Then he walked out. She understood this as Roy Dawson's version of an endorsement and took it as one. On a Thursday evening in November, almost exactly a year after Eleanor Graves had first arrived at a stock fair looking for a hiring notice that was already 2 weeks old, she was sitting at the desk in the corner office with the last of the day's work in front of her, and the ranch going quiet around her in its evening way,
and Silas came to the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and leaned against the frame in the way he'd been leaning against door frames since she'd known him, and said, "Leave it." She looked at the papers. "Leave it," he said again. "Come sit outside. The light's doing something." She looked at the papers one more time. Then she put the pen down. She followed him out to the porch, and they sat in the chairs that had been on that porch since before either of them was part of this place. And the light was doing something, the specific low gold of a late November afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look both real and slightly suspended, like the land is holding itself very still to let you see it properly. The east pasture was visible from the porch. The cottonwood had dropped its leaves but was still substantial against the sky. The hills at the county's edge were the deep blue-gray of late afternoon. She thought about a woman she'd been a year ago, careful, self-sufficient, competent to her core, and lonely to it too, carrying a drafted contract to a hiring table at a frontier fair because she'd stopped waiting for circumstances to cooperate. That woman had been right to do what she'd done. She had been right to show up, right to tell the truth, right to do the work even when it expanded past anything she'd been hired for, right to stay when she could have left. The lesson wasn't that honesty gets rewarded. It doesn't always. Harold Combs existed. Garrett Holt existed. Victor Ashcroft existed, and he would come back somewhere under a different name and do it again because that is what people like him do. The world was not arranged to reward Eleanor Graves specifically, and she had never believed it was. The lesson was simpler and harder than that. The lesson was that you show up and you tell the truth and you do the work and you let yourself be seen, and sometimes, not always, not automatically, not because you deserve it in some cosmic accounting, but sometimes the sum of those things adds up to a life that is worth the effort of living it. She had spent 8 years running from belonging somewhere. She had finally understood, in Red Hollow, that she hadn't been running from belonging. She'd been running from the specific risk of belonging somewhere and having it taken away, which was a smaller and more honest fear than the general one. The risk hadn't disappeared. It was still real. But she had looked at it clearly and decided that the alternative, the careful, efficient, perpetually provisional life she'd been living, cost more than the risk. Silas reached over without looking at her and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. He didn't say anything. He was looking at the pasture and the light and the evening arriving across the land in that slow, inevitable way, and his hand was warm and solid and meant something without naming itself. She turned her hand over and held his. The east pasture held the last of the light a little longer than the rest of the land, the way good land does, and then it let it go. And the evening came the rest of the way in, and the ranch settled around them into night. And Eleanor Graves, Eleanor Mercer now, though she still thought of herself by both names, which seemed right, sat on the porch of a home she had not known she was looking for, and held the hand of a man she had not known she needed, and let herself, finally and without reservation, be where she was. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she had come to understand, everything.